Hello, chat. Not sure what I'm doing up here. Cat, please get off my keyboard. Alright, let's see here. So what do we want to do here? Multiple screens? I think so. Over here. Yeah. Alright. Side 7.
Side 7. Bungalow. More coffee? Hammond asked politely. No, thank you, Henry Wu said, leaning back in his chair. I couldn't eat anything more. They were sitting in the dining room of Hammond's bungalow in a secluded corner of the park not far from the labs. Wu had to admit that the bungalow Hammond had built for himself was elegant, with sparse, almost Japanese lines. And the dinner had been excellent, considering the dining room wasn't fully staffed yet. But there was something about Hammond that Wu found troubling. The old man was different in some way, subtly different. All during dinner, Wu had tried to decide what it was. In part, a tendency to ramble, to repeat himself, to retell old stories. In part, it was an emotional lability, flaring anger one moment, maudlin sentimentality the next. But all that could be understood as a natural concomitant of age. John Hammond was, after all, almost 77. But there was something else. A stubborn evasiveness, an insistence on having his way, and in the end a complete refusal to deal with the situation that now faced the park. Wu had been stunned by the evidence. He did not yet allow himself to believe the case was proved, that the dinosaurs were breeding. After Grant had asked about amphibian DNA, Wu had intended to go directly to his laboratory and check the computer records of the various DNA assemblies. Because if the dinosaurs were in fact breeding, then everything about Jurassic Park was called into question. Their genetic development methods, their genetic control methods, everything. Even the lysine dependency might be suspect. And if these animals could truly breed and could also survive in the wild... Henry Wu wanted to check the data at once, but Hammond had stubbornly insisted Wu accompany him at dinner. Now then, Henry, you must save room for ice cream, Hammond said, pushing back from the table. Maria makes the most wonderful ginger ice cream. All right. Wu looked at the beautiful, silent serving girl. His eyes followed her out of the room, and then he glanced up at the single video monitor mounted in the wall. The monitor was dark. Your monitor's out, Wu said. Is it? Hammond glanced over. Must be the storm. He reached behind him for the telephone. I'll just check with John in control. Wu could hear the static crackle on the telephone line. Hammond shrugged and set the receiver back in its cradle. Lines must be down, he said. Or maybe Nedry's still doing data transmission. He has quite a few bugs to fix this weekend. Nedry's a genius in his way, but we had to press him quite hard toward the end to make sure he got things right. Perhaps I should go to the control room and check, Wu said. No, Hammond said. There's no reason. If there were any problem, we'd hear about it. Ah. Maria came back into the room with 2 plates of ice cream. You must have just a little, Henry, Hammond said. It's made with fresh ginger from the eastern part of the island. It's an old man's vice ice cream, but still... Dutifully, Wu dipped his spoon. Outside, lightning flashed, and there was the sharp crack of thunder. That was close, Wu said. I hope the storm isn't frightening the children. I shouldn't think so, Hammond said. He tasted the ice cream. But I can't help but hold some fears about this park, Henry. Inwardly, Wu felt relieved. Perhaps the old man was going to face the facts after all. What kind of fears? You know, Jurassic Park's really made for children. The children of the world love dinosaurs, and the children are going to delight, just delight in this place. Their little faces will shine with the joy of finally seeing these wonderful animals. But I am afraid I may not live to see it, Henry. I may not live to see the joy on their faces. I think there are other problems, too, Wu said, frowning. But none so pressing on my mind as this, Hammond said, that I may not live to see their shining, delighted faces. This is our triumph, this park. We have done what we set out to do. And you remember our original intent was to use the newly emerging technology of genetic engineering to make money. A lot of money. Wu knew Hammond was about to launch into one of his old speeches. He held up his hand. I'm familiar with this, John. If you were going to start a bioengineering company, Henry, what would you do? Would you make products to help mankind? To fight illness and disease? Dear me, no. That's a terrible idea. A very poor use of new technology. Hammond shook his head sadly. Yet you'll remember, he said, the original genetic engineering companies like Genentech and Cetus were all started to make pharmaceuticals. New drugs for mankind. Noble, noble purpose. Unfortunately, drugs face all kinds of barriers. FDA testing alone takes 5 to 8 years, if you're lucky. Even worse, there are forces at work in the marketplace. Suppose you make a miracle drug for cancer or heart disease, as Genentech did. Suppose you now want to charge $1,000 or $2,000 a dose. You might imagine that is your privilege. After all, you invented the drug. You paid to develop and test it. You should be able to charge whatever you wish. But do you really think that the government will let you do that? No, Henry, they will not. Sick people aren't going to pay $1,000 a dose for needed medication. They won't be grateful, they'll be outraged. Blue Cross isn't going to pay it. They'll scream highway robbery. So something will happen. Your patent application will be denied. Your permits will be delayed. Something will force you to see reason and to sell your drug at a lower cost. From a business standpoint, that makes helping mankind a very risky business. Personally, I would never help mankind. Wu had heard the argument before, and he knew Hammond was right. Some new bioengineered pharmaceuticals had indeed suffered inexplicable delays and patent problems. Now, Hammond said, think how different it is when you're making entertainment. Nobody needs entertainment. That's not a matter for government intervention. If I charge $5,000 a day for my park, who is going to stop me? After all, nobody needs to come here. And far from being highway robbery, a costly price tag actually increases the appeal of the park. A visit becomes a status symbol, and all Americans love that. So do the Japanese. And of course, they have far more money. Hammond finished his ice cream, and Maria silently took the dish away. She's not from here, you know, he said. She's Haitian. Her mother is French. But in any case, Henry, you will recall that the original purpose behind pointing my company in this direction in the first place was to have freedom from government intervention anywhere in the world. Speaking of the rest of the world, Hammond smiled, we have already leased a large tract in the Azores for Jurassic Park Europe. And you know, we long ago obtained an island near Guam for Jurassic Park Japan. Construction on the next 2 Jurassic Parks will begin early next year. They will all be open within 4 years. At that time, direct revenues will exceed $10 billion a year. And merchandising, television, and ancillary rights should double that. I see no reason to bother with children's pets, which I'm told Lou Dodgson thinks we're planning to make. Here, Lou said softly, shaking his head. That's speaking conservatively, Hammond said. He smiled. There's no reason to speculate wildly. More ice cream, Henry. Did you find him? Arnold snapped when the guard walked into the control room. No, Mr. Arnold. Find him. I don't think he's in the building, Mr. Arnold. Then look in the lodge, Arnold said. Look in the maintenance building. Look in the utility shed. Look everywhere. But just find him. The thing is, the guard hesitated, Mr. Nedry's the fat man, is that right? That's right, Arnold said. He's fat. A fat slob. Well, Jimmy down in the main lobby said he saw the fat man go into the garage. Muldoon spun around. Into the garage? When? About 10, 15 minutes ago. Jesus, Muldoon said. The jeep screeched to a stop. Sorry, Harding said. In the headlamps, Ellie saw a herd of apatosaurs lumbering across the road. There were 6 animals, each the size of a house, and a baby as large as a full-grown horse. The apatosaurs moved in unhurried silence, never looking toward the jeep and its glowing headlamps. At one point, the baby stopped to lap water from a puddle in the road, then moved on. A comparable herd of elephants would have been startled by the arrival of a car, would have trumpeted and circled to protect the baby. But these animals showed no fear. Don't they see us? She said. Not exactly, no, Harding said. Of course, in a literal sense, they do see us, but we don't really mean anything to them. We hardly ever take cars out at night, and so they have no experience of them. We are just a strange, smelly object in their environment, representing no threat, and therefore no interest. I've occasionally been out at night visiting a sick animal, and on my way back, these fellows block the road for an hour or more. What do you do? Harding grinned. Play a recorded tyrannosaur roar. That gets them moving. Not that they care much about tyrannosaurs. These apatosaurs are so big, they don't really have any predators. They can break a tyrannosaur's neck with a swipe of their tail, and they know it. So does the tyrannosaur. But they do see us. I mean, if we were to get out of the car... Harding shrugged. They probably wouldn't react. Dinosaurs have excellent visual acuity, but they have a basic amphibian visual system. It's attuned to movement. They don't see unmoving things well at all. The animals moved on, their skin glistening in the rain. Harding put the car in gear. I think we can continue now, he said. Wu said, I suspect you may find there are pressures on your park, just as there are pressures on Genentech's drugs. He and Hammond had moved to the living room, and they were now watching the storm lash the big glass windows. I can't see how, Hammond said. The scientists may wish to constrain you, even to stop you. Well, they can't do that, Hammond said. He shook his finger at Wu. You know why the scientists would try to do that? It's because they want to do research, of course. And all they ever want to do is research, not to accomplish anything, not to make any progress, just do research. Well, they have a surprise coming to them. I wasn't thinking of that, Wu said. Hammond sighed. I'm sure it would be interesting for the scientists to do research, but you arrive at the point where these animals are simply too expensive to be used for research. This is wonderful technology, Henry, but it's also frightfully expensive technology. The fact is, it can only be supported as entertainment. Hammond shrugged. That's just the way it is. But if there are attempts to close down... Face the damn facts, Henry, Hammond said irritably. This isn't America. This isn't even Costa Rica. This is my island. I own it, and nothing is going to stop me from opening Jurassic Park to all the children of the world. He chuckled. Or at least to the rich ones. And I tell you, they'll love it. In the back seat of the Jeep, Ellie Sattler stared out the window. They had been driving through rain-drenched jungle for the last 20 minutes and had seen nothing since the apatosaurs crossed the road. We're near the jungle river now, he said as he drove. It's off there, somewhere to our left. Abruptly, he slammed on the brakes again. Stop in front of a flock of small grebes. Well, you're getting quite a show tonight, he said. Those are compies. Procompsognathids, Ellie thought, wishing that Grant were here to see them. This was the animal they had seen in the facts, back in Montana. The little dark green Procompsognathids scurried to the other side of the road, then squatted on their hind legs to look at the car, chittering briefly, before hurrying onward into the night. Odd, Harding said. Wonder where they're off to. Compies don't usually move at night, you know. They climb up in a tree and wait for daylight. Then why are they out now? Ellie said. I can't imagine. You know, compies are scavengers, like buzzards. They're attracted to a dying animal, and they have tremendously sensitive smell. They can smell a dying animal for miles. Then they're going to a dying animal? Dying or already dead. Should we follow them? Ellie said. I'd be curious, Harding said. Yes, why not? Let's go see where they're going. He turned the car around. and headed back toward the compies. Tim Murphy lay in the Land Cruiser, his cheek pressed against the car door handle. He drifted slowly back to consciousness. He wanted only to sleep. He shifted his position and felt the pain in his cheekbone where it lay against the metal door. His whole body ached, his arms and his legs, and most of all his head. There was a terrible pounding pain in his head. All the pain made him want to go back to sleep. He pushed himself up on one elbow, opened his eyes, and retched, vomiting all over his shirt. He tasted sour bile and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His head throbbed. He felt dizzy and seasick, as if the world were moving, as if he were rocking back and forth on a boat. He groaned and rolled onto his back, turning away from the puddle of vomit. The pain in his head made him breathe in short, shallow gasps, and he still felt sick, as if everything were moving. He opened his eyes and looked around, trying to get his bearings. He was inside the Land Cruiser. The car must have flipped over on its side because he was lying on his back against the passenger door, looking up at the steering wheel and beyond at the branches of a tree moving in the wind. The rain had nearly stopped, but water drops still fell on him through the broken front windshield. He stared curiously at the fragments of glass. He couldn't remember how the windshield had broken. He couldn't remember anything, except that they had been parked in the road, and he had been talking to Dr. Grant when the Tyrannosaur came toward them. That was the last thing he remembered. He felt sick again and closed his eyes until the nausea passed. He was aware of a rhythmic creaking sound, like the rigging of a boat. Dizzy and sick to his stomach, he really felt as if the whole car were moving beneath him. But when he opened his eyes again, he saw it was true. The Land Cruiser was moving, lying on its side, swaying back and forth. The whole car was moving. Tentatively, Tim rose to his feet. Standing on the passenger door, he peered over the dashboard, looking out through the shattered windshield. At first, he saw only dense foliage moving in the wind, but here and there he could see gaps. Beyond the foliage, the ground was 20 feet below him. He stared uncomprehendingly. The Land Cruiser was lying on its side in the branches of a large tree, 20 feet above the ground, swaying back and forth in the wind. Shit! What was he going to do? He stood on his tiptoes and peered out, trying to see better, grabbing the steering wheel for support. The wheel spun free in his hand, and with a loud crack, the Land Cruiser shifted position, dropping a few feet in the branches of the tree. He looked down through the shattered glass of the passenger door window at the ground below. Oh shit, he kept repeating. Oh shit, oh shit! Another loud crack. The Land Cruiser jolted down another foot. Can he get out of here? He looked down at his feet. He was standing on the doorhead. He crouched back down on his hands and knees to look at the handle. He couldn't see very well in the dark, but he could tell that the door was dented outward, so the handle couldn't turn. He'd never get the door open. He tried to roll the window down, but the window was stuck too. Then he thought of the back door. Maybe he could open that. He leaned over the front seat, and the Land Cruiser lurched with a shift in weight. Carefully, Tim reached back and the door. It was stuck too. How was he going to get out? He heard a snorting sound and looked down. A dark shape passed below him. It wasn't the Tyrannosaur. This shape was tubby. It made a kind of snuffling as it waddled along. The tail flopped back and forth, and Tim could see the long spikes. It was the Stegosaur, apparently recovered from his illness. He wondered where the other people were, Gennaro and Sattler and the vet. He had last seen them near the Stegosaur. How long ago was that? He looked at his watch. His face was cracked. He couldn't see the numbers. He took the watch off and tossed it aside. The Stegosaur snuffled and moved on. Now the only sound was the wind in the trees. The creaking of the Land Cruiser as it shifted back and forth. He had to get out of here. Tim grabbed the handle, tried to force it, but but it was stuck solid. It wouldn't move at all. He realized what was wrong. The rear door was locked. Tim pulled up the pin and twisted the handle. The rear door swung open, downward, and came to rest against the branch a few feet below. The opening was narrow, but Tim thought he could wriggle through it. Holding his breath, he crawled slowly back. The Land Cruiser creaked, but held its position. Gripping the doorposts on both sides, Tim slowly lowered himself down through the narrow, angled opening. Soon he was lying flat on his stomach on the slanted door, his legs sticking out of the car. He kicked in the air. His feet touched something solid, a branch, and he rested his feet on it. As soon as he did, the branch bent down and the door swung wider, spilling him out of the Land Cruiser, and he fell, leaves scratching his face, his body bouncing from branch to branch, a jolt, searing pain, bright light in his head. He slammed to a stop, the wind knocked from him. Tim lay doubled over a large branch, his stomach burning pain. Tim heard another crack and looked up at the Land Cruiser, a big, dark shape 5 feet above him. Another crack. The car shifted. He forced himself to move, to climb down. He used to like to climb trees. He was a good tree climber. And this was a good tree to climb. Branches spaced close together, almost like a staircase. Crack! The car was definitely moving. Tim scrambled downward, slipping over the wet branches, feeling sticky sap on his hands, hurrying. He had not descended more than a few feet when the Land Cruiser creaked a final time and then slowly, very slowly nosed over. Tim could see the big green grille and the front headlights swinging down at him. And then the Land Cruiser fell free, gaining momentum as it rushed toward him, slamming against the branch where Tim had just been, and it stopped. His face, just inches from the dented grille, bent inward like an evil mouth, headlamps for eyes. Oil dripped on Tim's face. He was still 12 feet above the ground. He reached down, found another branch, and moved down. Above, he saw the branch bending under the weight of the Land Cruiser, and then it cracked, and the Land Cruiser came rushing down toward him, and he knew he could never escape it. He could never get down fast enough, so Tim just let go. He fell the rest of the way. Tumbling, banging, feeling pain in every part of his body, hearing the Land Cruiser smashing down through the branches after him like a pursuing animal, and then Tim's shoulder hit the soft ground, and he rolled as hard as he could and pressed his body against the trunk of the tree as the Land Cruiser tumbled down with a loud metallic crash and a sudden hot burst of electrical sparks that stung his skin and sputtered and sizzled on the wet ground around him. Slowly, Tim got to his feet. In the darkness, he heard the snuffling and saw the stegosaur coming back, apparently attracted by the crash of the Land Cruiser. The dinosaur moved dumbly, the low head thrust forward, and the big cartilaginous plates running in 2 rows along the hump of the back. It behaved like an overgrown tortoise, stupid like that, and slow. Tim picked up a rock and threw it. "Get away!" The rock thunked dully off the plates. The stegosaur kept coming. "Go on! Go!" He threw another rock and hit the stegosaur in the head. The animal grunted, turned slowly away, and shuffled off in the direction it had come. Tim leaned against the crumpled Land Cruiser and looked around in the darkness. He had to get back to the others, but he didn't want to get lost. He knew he was somewhere in the park, probably not far from the main road, if he could only get his bearings. He couldn't see much in the dark, but then he remembered the goggles. He climbed through the shattered front windshield into the Land Cruiser and found the night vision goggles and the radio. The radio was broken and silent, so he left it behind, but the goggles still worked. He flicked them on, saw the reassuringly familiar phosphorescent green image. Wearing the goggles, he saw the battered fence off to his left and walked toward it. The fence was 12 feet high, but the Tyrannosaur had flattened it easily. Tim hurried across it, moved through an area of dense foliage, and came out onto the main road. Through his goggles, he saw the other Land Cruiser turned on its side. He ran toward it, took a breath, and looked inside. The car was empty. No sign of Dr. Grant and Dr. Malcolm. Where had they gone? Where had everybody gone? He felt sudden panic, standing alone in the jungle road at night with that empty car, and turned quickly in circles, seeing the bright green world in the goggles swirl. Something pale by the side of the road caught his eye. It was Lex's face. He wiped the mud off it. "Lex!" Tim shouted as loud as he could, not caring if the animals heard him. He listened, but there was only wind and the blink of raindrops falling from the trees. "Lex!" He vaguely remembered that she had been in the Land Cruiser when the Tyrannosaur attacked. Had she stayed there? Or had she gotten away? The events of the attack were confused in his mind. He wasn't exactly sure what had happened. Just to think of it made him uneasy. He stood in the road, gasping with panic. "Lex!" The night seemed to close in around him. Feeling sorry for himself, he sat in a cold, rainy puddle in the road and whimpered for a while. When he finally stopped, he still heard whimpering. It was faint, and it was coming from somewhere farther up the road. "How long has it been?" Muldoon said, coming back into the control room. He was carrying a black metal case. "Half an hour. Harding's Jeep should be back here by now." Arnold stubbed out his cigarette. "I'm sure they'll arrive any minute now." "Still no sign of Nedry?" Muldoon said. "Nope, not yet." Muldoon opened the case, which contained 6 portable radios. "I'm going to distribute these to people in the building." He handed one to Arnold. "Take the charger, too. These are our emergency radios, but nobody had them plugged in, naturally. Let it charge about 20 minutes and then try and raise the cars." Henry Wu opened the door marked fertilization and entered the darkened lab. There was nobody here. Apparently, all the technicians were still at dinner. Wu went directly to the computer terminal and punched up the DNA logbooks. The logbooks had to be kept on computer. DNA was such large that each species required 10 gigabytes of optical disk space to store details of all the iterations. He was going to have to check all 15 species. That was a tremendous amount of information to search through. He still wasn't clear about why Grant thought frog DNA was important. Wu himself didn't often distinguish one kind of DNA from another. After all, most DNA in living creatures was exactly the same. DNA was an incredibly ancient substance. Human beings walking around in the streets of the modern world, bouncing their pink new babies, hardly stopped to think that the substance at the center of it all, the substance that began the dance of life, was a chemical almost as old as the Earth itself. The DNA molecule was so old that its evolution had essentially finished more than 2 billion years ago. There had been little new since that time. Just a few recent combinations of the old genes and not much of that. When you compared the DNA of man and the DNA of a lowly bacterium, you found that only about 10% of the strands were different. This innate conservatism of DNA emboldened Wu to use whatever DNA he wished. Making his dinosaurs, Wu had manipulated the DNA as a sculptor might clay or marble. He had created freely. He started the computer search program, knowing it would take 2 or 3 minutes to run. He got up and walked around the lab, checking instruments out of long-standing habit. He noted the recorder outside the freezer door, which tracked the freezer temperature. He saw there was a spike in the graph. That was odd, he thought. It meant somebody had been in the freezer. Recently, too, within the last half hour. But who would go in there at night? The computer beeped, signaling that the first of the data searches was complete. Wu went over to see what it had found, and when he saw the screen, he forgot all about the freezer and the graph spike. Leitska DNA search algorithm. DNA. Version search criteria. RNA. All. Fragment. Len greater than 0. DNA incorporating RNA fragments. Myosaurs. Versions 2.1 to 2.9. Procompsognathus. Versions 3.0 to 3.7. Ophnelia. Versions 3.1 to 3.3. Velociraptors, version 1.0 to 3.0. Hypsilophodontids, versions 2.4 to 2.7. The result was clear. All breeding dinosaurs incorporated rana, or frog DNA. None of the other animals. Wu still did not understand why this had caused them to breed, but he could no longer deny that Grant was right. The dinosaurs were breeding. He hurried up to the control room. Lex. She was curled up inside a big 1-meter drainage pipe that ran under the road. She had her baseball glove in her mouth, and she was rocking back and forth, banging her head repeatedly against the back of the pipe. It was dark in there, but he could see her clearly with his goggles. She seemed unhurt, and he felt a great burst of relief.
Lex, it's me, Tim.
She didn't answer. She continued to bang her head on the pipe.
Come on out.
She shook her head no. He could see she was badly frightened.
Lex,
He said.
if you come out, I'll let you wear these night goggles.
She just shook her head.
Look what I have.
He said, holding up his hand. She stared uncomprehendingly. It was probably too dark for her to see.
It's your ball, Lex. I found your ball. So what?
He tried another approach.
It must be uncomfortable in there. Cold, too. Wouldn't you like to come out?
She resumed, banging her head against the pipe.
Why not? There's aminals out there.
That threw him for a moment. She hadn't said aminals for years.
The aminals are gone, he said. There's a big one. A Tyrannosaurus Rex. He's gone. Where did he go? I don't know, but he's not around here now,
Tim said, hoping it was true. Lex didn't move. He heard her banging again. Tim sat down in the grass outside the pipe where she could see him. The ground was wet where he sat. He hugged his knees and waited. He couldn't think of anything else to do.
I'm just gonna sit here, he said, and rest. Is Daddy out there?
No, he said, feeling strange.
He's back at home, Lex. Is Mommy?
No, Lex.
Are there any grown-ups out there?
Lex said.
Not yet, but I'm sure they'll come soon. They're probably on their way right now.
Then he heard her moving inside the pipe, and she came out, shivering with cold and with dried blood on her forehead, but otherwise all right. She looked around in surprise and said,
Where's Dr. Grant?
I don't know.
Well, he was here before.
He was? When?
Before,
Lex said.
I saw him when I was in the pipe. Where'd he go? How am I supposed to know?
Lex said, wrinkling her nose. She began to shout,
Hello? Hello? Dr. Grant? Dr. Grant?
Tim was uneasy at the noise she was making. It might bring back the Tyrannosaur. But a moment later, he heard an answering shout. It was coming from the right, over toward the Land Cruiser that Tim had left a few minutes before. With his goggles, Tim saw with relief that Dr. Grant was walking toward them. He had a big tear in his shirt at the shoulder, but otherwise he looked okay. Thank God, he said. I've been looking for you. Shivering, Ed Regis got to his feet and wiped the cold mud off his face and hands. He had spent a very bad half hour, wedged among big boulders on the slope of a hill below the road. He knew it wasn't much of a hiding place, but he was panicked, and he wasn't thinking clearly. He had lain in this muddy, cold place, and he had tried to get hold of himself, but he kept seeing that dinosaur in his mind, a dinosaur coming toward him, toward the car. Ed Regis didn't remember exactly what had happened after that. He remembered that Lex had said something, but he hadn't stopped. He couldn't stop. He had just kept running and running. Beyond the road, he had lost his footing and tumbled down the hill and come to rest by some boulders. And it had seemed to him that he could crawl in among the boulders and hide. There was enough room, though that was what he had done. Gasping and terrified, thinking of nothing except to get away from the Tyrannosaur. And finally, when he was wedged in there like a rat between the boulders, he had calmed down a little, and he had been overcome with horror and shame because he'd abandoned those kids. He had just run away. He had just saved himself. He knew he should go back up to the road, he should try to rescue them, because he had always imagined himself as brave and cool under pressure. But whenever he tried to get control of himself, to make himself go back up there, somehow he just couldn't. He started to feel panicky, and he had trouble breathing, and he didn't move. He told himself it was hopeless anyway. If the kids were still up there on the road, they could never survive. And certainly there was nothing Ed Regis could do for them, and he might as well stay where he was. No one was going to know what had happened except him, and there was nothing he could do, nothing he could have done. And so Regis had remained among the boulders for half an hour, fighting off panic, carefully not thinking about whether the kids had died or about what Hammond would have to say when he found out. What finally made him move was the peculiar sensation he noticed in his mouth. The side of his mouth felt funny, kind of numb, tingling. He wondered if he had hurt it during the fall. Regis touched his face and felt swollen flesh on the side of his mouth. It was funny, but it didn't hurt at all. Then he realized the swollen flesh was a leech, growing fat as it sucked his lips. It was practically in his mouth. Shivering with nausea, Regis pulled the leech away, feeling a tear from the flesh of his lips, feeling the gush of warm blood in his mouth. He spat and flung it with disgust into the forest. He saw another leech on his forearm and pulled it off, leaving a dark, bloody streak behind. Jesus, he was probably covered with them. And fall down the hillside. These jungle hills were full of leeches. So were the dark, rocky crevices. What did the workmen say? The leeches crawled up your underwear. They liked dark, warm places. They liked to crawl right up your... Hello! He stopped. It was a voice. Hello! Dr. Grant! Jesus, that was the little girl. Ed Regis listened to the tone of her voice. She didn't sound frightened or in pain. She was just calling in her insistent way. And it slowly dawned on him that something else must have happened. That the Tyrannosaur must have gone away, or at least hadn't attacked, and that the other people might still be alive. Grant and Malcolm, everybody might be alive. And the realization made him pull himself together in an instant, the way you got sober in an instant when the cops pulled you over. And he felt better, because now he knew what he had to do. And as he crawled out from the boulders, he was already formulating the next step, already figuring out what he would say, how to handle things from this point. Regis wiped the cold mud off his face and hands, the evidence that he had been hiding. He wasn't embarrassed that he had been hiding, but now he had to take charge. He scrambled back up toward the road, but when he emerged from the foliage, he had a moment of disorientation. He didn't see the cars at all. He was somehow at the bottom of the hill. The Land Cruisers must be at the top. He started walking up the hill, back toward the Land Cruisers. It was very quiet. His feet splashed in the muddy puddles. He wasn't a little girl anymore. Why had she stopped calling? As he walked, he began to think maybe something had happened to her. In that case, he shouldn't walk back there. Maybe the Tyrannosaur was still hanging around. Here he was, already at the bottom of the hill, that much closer to home. And it was so quiet. Spooky it was so quiet. Ed Regis turned around and started walking back toward the camp. Alan Grant ran his hands over her limbs, squeezing the arms and legs briefly. She didn't seem to have any pain. It was amazing. Aside from covering her head, she was fine. I told you what it was, she said. Well, I had a check. The boy was not quite so close. Tim's nose was swollen and painful. Grant suspected it was broken. His right shoulder was badly bruised and swollen, but his legs seemed to be all right. Both kids could walk, that was the important thing. Grant himself was all right, except for a claw abrasion down his right chest where the Tyrannosaur had kicked him. It burned with every breath, but it didn't seem to be serious, and it didn't limit his movement. He wondered if he had been knocked unconscious because he had only dim recollections of things immediately preceding the moment he had sat up, groaning, in the woods, 10 yards from the Land Cruiser. At first his chest had been bleeding, so he had stuck leaves on the wound, and after a while it clotted. Then he had started walking around looking for Malcolm and the kids. Grant couldn't believe he was still alive, and as scattered images began to come back to him, he tried to make sense of them. The Tyrannosaur should have killed them all, easily. Why hadn't it?
I'm hungry,
Lex said. Me too, Grant said. We've got to get ourselves back to civilization, and we've got to tell them about the ship.
We're the only ones who know, Tim said.
Yes, we've got to get back and tell them.
Then let's walk down the road toward the hotel, Tim said, pointing down the hill. That way we'll meet them when they come for us.
Grant considered that, and he kept thinking about one thing, the dark shape that crossed between the land cruisers even before the attack started. What animal had that been? He could think of only one possibility, the little Tyrannosaurus. I don't think so, Tim. The road has high fences on both sides. If one of the Tyrannosaurs is further down on the road, we'll be trapped.
Then should we wait here? Tim said.
Yes, Grant said. Let's just wait here until someone comes.
I'm hungry,
Lex said. I hope it won't be very long, Grant said.
I don't want to stay here,
Lex said. Then, from the bottom of the hill, they heard the sound of a man coughing. Stay here, Grant said. He ran forward to look down the hill. Stay here, Tim said, and he ran forward after him. Lex followed her brother.
Don't leave me. Don't leave me here, you guys.
Grant clapped his hand over her mouth. She struggled to protest. He shook his head and pointed over the hill for her to look. At the bottom of the hill, Grant saw Ed Regis standing rigid, unmoving. The forest around them had become deadly silent. The steady background drone of cicadas and frogs had ceased abruptly. There was only the faint rustle of leaves and the whines of wind. Lex started to speak, but Grant pulled her against the trunk of the nearest tree, ducking down among the heavy gnarled roots of the base. Tim came right at him. Grant put his hands to his lips, signaling them to be quiet, and then he slowly looked around the tree. The road below was dark, and as the branches of the big trees moved in the wind, the moonlight filtering through made a dappled shifting pattern. Ed Regis was gone. It took Grant a moment to locate him. The publicist was pressed up against the trunk of a big tree, hugging it. Regis wasn't moving at all. The forest remained silent. Lex tugged impatiently at Grant's shirt. She wanted to know what was happening. Then from somewhere very near, they heard a soft snorting exhalation, hardly louder than the wind. Lex heard it too because she stopped struggling. The sound floated toward them again, soft as a sigh. Grant thought it was almost like the breathing of a horse. Grant looked at Regis and saw the moving shadows cast by the moonlight on the trunk of the tree. And then Grant realized there was another shadow, superimposed on the others, but not moving. A strong, curved neck and a square head. The exhalation came again. Tim leaned forward cautiously to look. Lex did too. They heard a crack as a branch broke, and into the path stepped a Tyrannosaur. It was the juvenile, about 8 feet tall. It moved with the clumsy gait of a young animal, almost like a puppy. The juvenile Tyrannosaur shuffled down the path, stopping with every step to sniff the air before moving on. It passed the tree where Regis was hiding and gave no indication that it had seen him. Grant saw Regis's body relax slightly. Regis turned his head, trying to watch the Tyrannosaur on the far side of the tree. The Tyrannosaur was now out of view down the road. Regis started to relax, releasing his grip on the tree. But the jungle remained silent. Regis remained close to the tree trunk for another half-minute. Then the sounds of the forest returned. The first tentative croak of a tree frog, the buzz of one cicada, and then the full call. Regis stepped away from the tree, shaking his shoulders, releasing the tension. He walked into the middle of the road, looking in the direction of the departed Tyrannosaur. The attack came from the left. The juvenile roared as it swung its head forward, knocking Regis flat to the ground. He yelled and scrambled to his feet, but the Tyrannosaur pounced and it must have pinned him with its hind leg because suddenly Regis wasn't moving. He was sitting up in the path, shouting at the dinosaur and waving his hands at it as if he could scare it off. The young dinosaur seemed perplexed by the sounds and movement coming from its tiny prey. The juvenile bent its head over, sniffing curiously, and Regis pounded on the snout with his fists. "Get away! Back off! Go on, back off!" Regis was shouting at the top of his lungs, and the dinosaur backed away, allowing Regis to get to his feet. Regis was shouting, "Yeah, you heard me! Back off! Get away!" as he moved away from the dinosaur. The juvenile continued to stare curiously at the odd, noisy little animal before it, but when Regis had gone a few paces, it lunged and knocked him down again. "It's playing with him." "Hey!" Regis shouted as he fell. But the juvenile did not pursue him, allowing him to get to his feet. He jumped to his feet and continued backing away. "You stupid! Back! Back! You heard me! Back!" he shouted like a lion tamer. The juvenile roared, but it did not attack, and Regis now edged toward the trees and high foliage to the right. In another few steps, he would be in hiding. "Back, you! Back!" Regis shouted. And then, at the last moment, the juvenile pounced and knocked Regis flat on his back. "Cut that out!" Regis yelled. And the juvenile ducked his head, and Regis began to scream. No words, just a high-pitched scream. The scream cut off abruptly, and when the juvenile lifted his head, Grant saw ragged flesh in his jaws. "Oh, no," Lex said softly. Beside her, Tim had turned away, suddenly nauseated. His night vision goggles slipped from his forehead and landed on the ground with a metallic clink. The juvenile's head snapped up, and it looked toward the top of the hill. Tim picked up his goggles as Grant grabbed both the children's hands and began to run. Control. In the night, the compies scurried along the side of the road. Harding's jeep followed a short distance behind. Ellie pointed farther up the road. "Is that a light?" "Could be," Harding said. "Looks almost like headlights." The radio suddenly hummed and crackled. They heard John Arnold say, "You there?" "Ah, there he is," Harding said, finally. He pressed the button. "Yes, John, we're here. We're near the river, following the compies. It's quite interesting." More crackling. Then, "Eat your car!" "What did he say?" Gennaro said. "Something about a car," Ellie said. At Grant's dig in Montana, Ellie was the one who operated the radio phone. After years of experience, she'd become skilled at picking up garbled transmissions. "I think he said he needs your car." Harding pressed the button. "John, are you there? We can't read you very well. John?" There was a flash of lightning, followed by a long sizzle of radio static. Then Arnold's tense voice. "Where are... Ooh. We're 1 mile north of the Hipsy paddock, near the river, following some compies." "No! Damn well! Get back here! Ow!" "Sounds like he's got a problem," Ellie said, frowning. There was no mistaking the tension in the voice. "Maybe we should go back." Harding shrugged. "John's frequently got a problem. You know how engineers are. They want everything to go by the book." He pressed the button on the radio. "John, say again, please." More crackling. More static. The loud crash of lightning. Then, "Muldoon, need your car. Ow!" Gennaro frowned. "Is he saying Muldoon needs our car?" "That's what it sounded like," Ellie said. "Well, that doesn't make any sense," Harding said. "Other stuck. Muldoon wants car." "I get it," Ellie said. "The other cars are stuck on the road in the storm, and Muldoon wants to go get them." Harding shrugged. "Why doesn't Muldoon take the other car?" He pushed the radio button. "John, tell Muldoon to take the other car. It's in the garage." The radio crackled. "Not listen, crazy bastards! Car!" Harding pressed the radio button. "I said it's in the garage, John. The car is in the garage." More static. "Edry has... Sing... One." "I'm afraid this isn't getting us anywhere," Harding said. All right, John, we're coming in now. He turned the radio off and turned the car around. I just wish I understood what the urgency is. Harding put the Jeep in gear, and they rumbled down the road in the darkness. It was another 10 minutes before they saw the welcoming lights of the safari lodge, and as Harding pulled to a stop in front of the visitor center, they saw Muldoon coming toward them. He was shouting and waving his arms. God damn it, Arnold, you son of a bitch! God damn it, get this park back on track! Now! Get my grandkids back here, now! John Hammond stood in the control room screaming and stamping his little feet. He had been carrying on this way for the last 2 minutes, while Henry Wu stood in the corner looking stunned. Well, Mr. Hammond, Arnold said, Muldoon's on his way out right now to do exactly that. Arnold turned away and lit another cigarette. Hammond was like every other management guy Arnold had ever seen. Whether it was Disney or the Navy, management guys always behaved the same. They never understood the technical issues. And they thought that screaming was the way to make things happen. And maybe it was, if you were shouting at your secretaries to get you a limousine. But screaming didn't make any difference at all to the problems that Arnold now faced. The computer didn't care if it was screamed at. The power network didn't care if it was screamed at. Technical systems were completely indifferent to all this explosive human emotion. If anything, screaming was counterproductive because Arnold now faced the virtual certainty that Nedry wasn't coming back, which meant that Arnold himself had to go into the computer code and try to figure out what had gone wrong. It was going to be a painstaking job. He'd need to be calm and careful. Why don't you go downstairs to the cafeteria, Arnold said, and get a cup of coffee. We'll call you when we have more news. I don't want a Malcolm effect here, Hammond said. Don't worry about a Malcolm effect, Arnold said. Will you let me go to work? God damn you, Hammond said. I'll call you, sir, when I have news from Muldoon, Arnold said. He pushed buttons on his console and saw the familiar control screens change. Stroke Jurassic Park main module stroke. Stroke call libs. Include biostat.sys. Include sysrom.vst. Include net.sys. Include power.module. Stroke initialize. Arnold was no longer operating the computer. He had now gone behind the scenes to look at the code, the line-by-line instructions that told the computer how to behave. Arnold was unhappily aware that the complete Jurassic Park program contained more than 500,000 lines of code, most of it undocumented, without explanation. Wu came forward. What are you doing, John? Checking the code. By inspection? That'll take forever. Tell me, Arnold said. Tell me. The road. Muldoon took the curve very fast, the Jeep sliding on the mud. Sitting beside him, Gennaro clenched his fists. They were racing along the cliff road high above the river, now hidden below them in darkness. Muldoon accelerated forward, his face was tense. How much farther? Gennaro said. 2, maybe 3 miles. Ellie and Harding were back at the visitor center. Gennaro had offered to accompany Muldoon. The car swerved. It's been an hour, Muldoon said, an hour, with no word from the other cars. But they have radios, Gennaro said. We haven't been able to raise them, Muldoon said. Gennaro frowned. If I was sitting in a car for an hour in the rain, I'd sure try to use the radio to call for somebody. So would I, Muldoon said. Gennaro shook his head. You really think something could have happened to them? Chances are, Muldoon said, that they're perfectly fine, but I'll be happier when I finally see them. Should be any minute now. The road curved, then ran up a hill. At the base of the hill, Gennaro saw something white lying among the ferns by the side of the road. Hold it, Gennaro said, and Muldoon braked. Gennaro jumped out and ran forward in the headlights of the Jeep to see what it was. It looked like a piece of clothing, but there was... Gennaro stopped. Even from 6 feet away, he could see clearly what it was. He walked forward more slowly. Muldoon leaned out of the car and said, What is it? It's a leg, Gennaro said. The flesh of the leg was pale blue-white, terminating in a jagged, bloody stump where the knee had been. Below the calf, he saw a white sock and a brown slip-on shoe. It was a kind of shoe Ed Regis had been wearing. By then, Muldoon was out of the car, running past him to crouch over the leg. Jesus! He lifted the leg out of the foliage, raising it into the light of the headlamp, and blood from the stump gushed down over his hand. Gennaro was still 3 feet away. He quickly bent over, put his hands on his knees, squeezed his eyes shut, and breathed deeply, trying not to be sick. "Gennaro!" Muldoon's voice was sharp. "What?" "Move! You're blocking the light." Gennaro took a breath and moved. When he opened his eyes, he saw Muldoon peering critically at the stump. "Torn at the joint line," Muldoon said. "Didn't bite it, twisted and ripped it. Just ripped his leg off." Muldoon stood up, holding the severed leg upside down, so the remaining blood dripped onto the ferns. His bloody hand smudged the white sock as he gripped the ankle. Gennaro felt sick again. "No question what happened," Muldoon was saying. "The T-Rex got him." Muldoon looked up the hill, then back to Gennaro. "You all right? You go on?" "Yes," Gennaro said. "I can go on." Muldoon was walking back toward the jeep, carrying the leg. "I guess we better bring this along," he said. "Doesn't seem right to leave it here. Christ, it's going to make a mess of the car. See if there's anything in the back, will you? A tarp, newspaper." Gennaro opened the back door and rummaged around in the space behind the rear seat. He felt grateful to think about something else. The problem of how to wrap the severed leg expanded to fill his mind, crowding out all other thoughts. He found a canvas bag with a toolkit, a wheel rim, a cardboard box, and 2 tarps, he said. They were neatly folded plastic. "Give me one," Muldoon said, still standing outside the car. Muldoon wrapped the leg and passed the now shapeless bundle to Gennaro. Holding it in his hand, Gennaro was surprised at how heavy it felt. "Just put it in the back," Muldoon said. "If there's a way to wedge it, so it doesn't roll around." "Okay." Gennaro put the bundle in the back, and Muldoon got behind the wheel. He accelerated, the wheel spinning in the mud, then digging in. The jeep rushed up the hill, and for a moment at the top, the headlights still pointed upward into the foliage, and then they swung down, and Gennaro could see the road before them. "Jesus," Muldoon said. Gennaro saw a single Land Cruiser lying on its side in the center of the road. He couldn't see the second Land Cruiser. "Where's the other car?" Muldoon looked around, pointed to the left. "There." The second Land Cruiser was 20 feet away, crumpled at the foot of the tree. "What's it doing there?" "T-Rex threw it." "Threw it?" Gennaro said. Muldoon's face was red. "Let's get this over with," he said, climbing out. They hurried forward to the second Land Cruiser. Their flashlights swung back and forth. As they came closer, Gennaro saw how battered it was. He was careful to let Muldoon look inside first. "I wouldn't worry," Muldoon said. "It's very unlikely we'll find anyone." "No?" "No," he said. He explained that during his years in Africa, he had visited the scenes of a half-dozen animal attacks on humans in the bush. One leopard attack. The leopard had torn open a tent in the night and taken a 3-year-old child. Then one buffalo attack in Amboseli. 2 lion attacks. One croc attack in the north near Meru. In every case, there was surprisingly little evidence left behind. Inexperienced people imagined horrific proofs of an animal attack, torn limbs left behind in the tent, trails of dripping blood leading away into the bush, blood-stained clothing far from the campsite. But the truth was, there was usually nothing at all, particularly if the victim was small, an infant or a young child. The person just seemed to disappear, as if he had walked out into the bush and never come back. A predator could kill a child just by shaking it, snapping the neck. Usually there wasn't any blood. And most of the time you never found any other remains of the victim. Sometimes a button from a shirt or a sliver of rubber from a shoe, but most of the time, nothing. Predators took children, they preferred children, and they left nothing behind. So Muldoon thought it highly unlikely that they would ever find any remains of the children. But as he looked in now, he had a surprise. I'll be damned, he said. Muldoon tried to put the scene together. The front windshield of the Land Cruiser was shattered, but there wasn't much glass nearby. He had noticed shards of glass back on the road, so the windshield must have been broken back there before the Tyrannosaur picked the car up and threw it here. But the car had taken a tremendous beating. Muldoon shone his light inside. Empty? Gennaro said tensely. Not quite, Muldoon said. His flashlight glinted off a crushed radio handset, and on the floor of the car he saw something else, something curved and black. The front doors were dented and jammed shut, but he climbed in through the back door and crawled over the seat to pick up the black object. It's a watch, he said, peering at it in the beam of his flashlight. A cheap digital watch with a molded black rubber strap. The LCD face was shattered. He thought the boy might have been wearing it, though he wasn't sure. It was the kind of watch a kid would have. What is it, a watch? Gennaro said. Yes, and there's a radio, but it's broken. Is that significant? Yes, and there's something else. Muldoon sniffed. There was a sour odor inside the car. He shone the light around until he saw the vomit dripping off the side door panel. He touched it, still fresh. One of the kids may still be alive, Muldoon said. Gennaro squinted at him. What makes you think so? The watch, Muldoon said. The watch proves it. He handed the watch to Gennaro, who held it to the glow of the flashlight and turned it over in his hand. Crystal is cracked, Gennaro said. That's right, Muldoon said. And the band is uninjured. Which means the kid took it off. That could have happened any time, Any time before the attack. No, Muldoon said. Those LCD crystals are tough. It takes a powerful blow to break them. The watch face was shattered during the attack. So the kid took his watch off. Think about it, Muldoon said. If you were being attacked by a Tyrannosaur, would you stop to take your watch off? Maybe it was torn off. It's almost impossible to tear a watch off somebody's wrist without tearing the hand off, too. Anyway, the band is intact. No, Muldoon said. The kid took it off himself. He looked at his watch, saw it was broken, and took it off. He had the time to do that. When? It could only have been after the attack, Muldoon said. The kid must have been in this car after the attack, and the radio was broken, so he left it behind, too. He's a bright kid, and he knew they weren't useless. If he's so bright, Gennaro said, where'd he go? Because I'd stay right here and wait to be picked up. Yes, Muldoon said, but perhaps he couldn't stay here. Maybe the Tyrannosaur came back, or some other animal. Anyway, something didn't leave. And where'd he go? Let's see if we can determine that, Muldoon said, and he strode off toward the main road. Gennaro watched Muldoon peering at the ground with his flashlight. His face was just inches from the mud, intent on his search. Muldoon really believed he was on to something, that at least one of the kids was still alive. Gennaro remained unimpressed. The shock of finding the severed leg had left him with a grim determination to close the park and destroy it. No matter what Muldoon said, Gennaro suspected him of unwarranted enthusiasm and hopefulness and... You notice these prints? Muldoon asked, still looking at the ground. What prints? Gennaro said. These footprints, see them? Coming toward us from up the road? And they're adult-sized prints, some kind of rubber-sole shoe. Notice the distinctive tread pattern. Gennaro saw only mud, puddles catching the light from the flashlights. You can see, Muldoon continued, the adult prints come to here, where they're joined by other prints, small and medium-sized, moving around in circles, overlapping, almost as if they're standing together talking. But now here they are, and they seem to be running. He pointed off. There, into the park. Gennaro shook his head. You can see whatever you want in this mud. Muldoon got to his feet and stepped back. He looked down at the ground and sighed. Say what you like. I'll wager one of the kids survived, and maybe both. Perhaps even an adult as well, if these big prints belong to someone other than Regis. We've got to search the park. Tonight? Gennaro said. But Muldoon wasn't listening. He had walked away toward an embankment of soft earth near a drain pipe for rain. He crouched again. What was that little girl wearing? Christ, Gennaro said, I don't know. Proceeding slowly, Muldoon moved farther toward the side of the road. Listen, Gennaro said, feeling panic. I think we better... Shh, Muldoon said. He paused. It's just the wind, Gennaro said. They heard the wheezing again, distinctly this time. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the foliage directly ahead of him, by the side of the road. It didn't sound like an animal, but Muldoon moved forward cautiously. He waggled his light and shouted, but the wheezing did not change character. Muldoon pushed aside the fronds of a palm. What is it? Gennaro said. It's Malcolm, Muldoon said. Ian Malcolm lay on his back, his skin grey-white, mouth slackly open. His breath came in wheezing gasps. Muldoon handed the flashlight to Gennaro and then bent to examine the body. I can't find the injury, he said. Head okay, chest, arms. Then Gennaro shone the light on the legs. He put a tourniquet on. Malcolm's belt was twisted tight over the right thigh. Gennaro moved the light down the leg. The right ankle was bent outward at an awkward angle from the leg, the trousers flattened, soaked in blood. Muldoon touched the ankle gently, and Malcolm groaned. Muldoon stepped back, tried to decide what to do next. Malcolm might have other injuries. His back might be broken. It might kill him. But if they left him here, he would die of shock. It was only because he had had the presence of mind to put a tourniquet on that he hadn't already bled to death. Probably he was wounded. He might as well. Gennaro helped Muldoon pick the man up, hoisting him awkwardly over their shoulders. Malcolm moaned and breathed in ragged gasps. Lex, he said. Lex went. Lex. Who's Lex? Muldoon said. The little girl, Gennaro said. They carried Malcolm back to the jeep and rested him into the back seat. Gennaro tightened the tourniquet around his leg. Malcolm groaned again. Muldoon slid the trouser cuff up and saw the pulpy flesh beneath, the dull white spoonfuls of protruding bone. We've got to get him back, Muldoon said. You going to leave here without the kids? Gennaro said. If they went into the park, it's 20 square miles, Muldoon said, shaking his head. The only way we can find anything out there is with a motion sensor. If the kids are alive and moving around, the motion sensors will pick them up, and we can go right to them and bring them back. But if we don't take Dr. Malcolm back right now, he'll die. Then we have to go back, Gennaro said. Yes, I think so. They climbed into the car. Gennaro said, Are you going to tell Hammond the kids are missing? No, Muldoon said. You are.
End of Side 7. Side 8.
Control. Donald Gennaro stared at Hammond, sitting in the deserted cafeteria. The man was spooning ice cream, calmly eating it. So, Muldoon believes the children are somewhere in the park. He thinks so, yes. Then I'm sure we'll find them. I hope so, Gennaro said. He watched the old man deliberately eating, and he felt a chill. Oh, I am sure we'll find them. After all, I keep telling everyone this park is made for kids. Gennaro said, Just so you understand that they're missing, sir. Missing? He snapped. Of course I know they're missing. I'm not senile. He sighed and changed tone again. Look, Donald, Hammond said, let's not get carried away. We've had a little breakdown from the storm or whatever, and as a result, we've suffered a regrettable, unfortunate accident. And that's all that's happened. We're dealing with it. Arnold will get the computers cleaned up. Muldoon will pick up the kids. And I have no doubt he'll be back with them by the time we finish this ice cream. So let's just wait and see what develops, shall we? Whatever you say, sir, Gennaro said. Why? Henry Wu said, looking at the console screen. Because I think Nedry did something to the code, Arnold said. That's why I'm checking. All right, Wu said, but have you tried your options? Like what? Arnold said. I don't know. Aren't the safety systems still running? Wu said. Key checks, all that? Jesus, Arnold said, snapping his fingers. They must be. Safety systems can't be turned off except at the main panel. Well, Wu said, if KeyChecks is active, you can trace what he did. I sure as hell can, Arnold said. He started to press buttons. Why hadn't he thought of it before? It was so obvious. The computer system at Jurassic Park had several tiers of safety systems built into it. One of them was a KeyCheck program, which monitored all the keystrokes entered by operators with access to the system. It was originally installed as a debugging device, but it was retained for its security value. In a moment, all the keystrokes that Nedry had entered into the computer earlier in the day were listed in a window on the screen. There was a string of numbers, followed by words, part words, and numerical instructions. System Nedry. Go to command level. Nedry. 040-hatchmark XY-67 ampersand. MR Goodbytes. Security. Keycheck off. Safety off. SL off. Security. White_rabbit.object. That's it, Arnold said. He was screwing around here for hours, it seemed like. Probably just killing time, Wu said, until he finally decided to get down to it. The initial list of numbers represented the ASCII keyboard codes for the keys Nedry had pushed at his console. Those numbers meant he was still within the standard user interface, like any ordinary user of the computer. So, initially, Nedry was just looking around, which you wouldn't have expected of a programmer who had designed the system. Maybe he was trying to see if there were changes before he went in, Wu said. Maybe, Arnold said. Arnold was now looking at the list of commands, which allowed him to follow Nedry's progression through the system line by line. At least we can see what he did. System was Nedry's request to leave the ordinary user interface and access the code itself. The computer asked for his name, and he replied Nedry. That name was authorized to access the code, so the computer allowed him into the system. Nedry asked to go to command level, the computer's highest level of control. The command level required extra security and asked Nedry for his name, access number, and password. Nedry 040-hatchmark XY-67 ampersand MR Goodbytes. Those entries got Nedry into the command level. From there, he wanted security, and since he was authorized, the computer allowed him to go there. Once at the security level, Nedry tried 3 variations. Keycheck off, safety off, SL off. He's trying to turn off the safety systems. He doesn't want anybody to see what he's about to do. Exactly, Arnold said. Apparently he doesn't know it's no longer possible to turn the system off except by manually flipping switches on the main board. After 3 failed commands, the computer automatically began to worry about Nedry. But since he had gotten in with proper authorization, the computer would assume that Nedry was lost, trying to do something he couldn't accomplish. So the computer asked him again where he wanted to be, and Nedry said security, and he was allowed to remain there. Finally, Wu said, here's the kicker. He pointed to the last of the commands Nedry had entered. White_rabbit.object. What the hell is that? Arnold said. White rabbit? Is that supposed to be his private joke? It's marked as an object, Wu said. In computer terminology, an object was a block of code that could be moved around and used the way you might move a chair in a room. An object might be a set of commands to draw a picture, or to refresh the screen, or to perform a certain calculation. Let's see where it is in the code, Arnold said. Maybe we can figure out what it does. He went to the program utilities and typed find white_rabbit.object. The computer flashed back, object not found in library. It doesn't exist, Arnold said. Then search the code listing, Wu said. Arnold typed find/listings white_rabbit.object. The screen scrolled rapidly, the lines of code blurring as they swept past. It continued this way for almost a minute, and then abruptly stopped. There it is, Wu said. It's not an object, it's a command. The screen showed an arrow pointing to a single line of code buried amidst innocuous lines of instructions. Arrow on white_rabbit.object call link. parenthesis security, perimeter, parenthesis set to off. Son of a bitch, Arnold said. Wu shook his head. It isn't a bug in the code at all. No, Arnold said, it's a trap door. The fat bastard put in what looked like an object call, but it's actually a command that links the security and perimeter systems and then turns them off. Gives him complete access to every place in the park. Then we must be able to turn them back on, Wu said. Yeah, we must. Arnold frowned at the screen. All we have to do is figure out the command. I'll run an execution trace on the link, he said. We'll see where that goes. Wu got up from his chair. Meanwhile, he said,
Meanwhile, that somebody went into the freezer about an hour ago. I think I better go count my embryos.
Ellie was in her room, about to change out of her wet clothes, when there was a knock on the door.
Alan?
She said. But when she opened the door, she saw Muldoon standing there, with a plastic-wrapped package under his arm. Muldoon was also soaking wet, and there were streaks of dirt on his clothes. I'm sorry, but we need your help, Muldoon said briskly. The land cruisers were attacked an hour ago. We brought Malcolm back, but he's in shock. He's got a very bad injury to his leg. He's still unconscious, but I put him in the bed in his room. Harding is on his way over.
Harding, she said. What about the others?
We haven't found the others yet, Dr. Sattler, Muldoon said. He was speaking slowly now.
Oh, my God.
But we think that Dr. Grant and the children are still alive. We think they went into the park, Dr. Sattler.
Went to the park?
We think so. Meanwhile, Malcolm needs help. I've called Harding. Shouldn't you call a doctor? There's no doctor on the island. Harding's the best we have. But surely you can call for a doctor, he said. No, Muldoon shook his head. Phone lines are down. We can't call out. He shifted the package in his arm. He said, nothing. Just go to Malcolm's room and help Harding, if you will. Muldoon was gone. She sat on her bed, shocked. Ellie Sattler was not a woman disposed to unnecessary panic, and she had known Grant to get out of dangerous situations before. Once he'd been lost in the Badlands for 4 days when a cliff gave way beneath him, and his truck fell 100 feet into a ravine. Grant's right leg was broken. He had no water, but he had walked back on a broken leg. On the other hand, shook her head, pushing the thought away. The kids were probably with Grant. And if Grant was out in the park, well, what better person to get them safely through Jurassic Park than a dinosaur expert? In the park.
Killed it.
I'm tired, Lex said. Carry me, Dr. Grant.
You're too big to carry, Tim said.
But I'm tired, she said.
Okay, Lex, Grant said, picking her up. Oof, you're heavy. It was almost 9 p.m. The full moon was blurred by drifting mist, and their blunted shadows led them across an open field toward dark woods beyond. Grant was lost in thought, trying to decide where he was. Since they had originally crossed over the fence that the Tyrannosaur had battered down, Grant was reasonably sure they were now somewhere in the Tyrannosaur paddock, which was a place he did not want to be. In his mind, he kept seeing the computer tracing of the Tyrannosaur's home range, the tight squiggle of lines that traced his movements within a small area. He and the kids were in that area now. But Grant also remembered that the Tyrannosaurs were isolated from all the other animals, which meant that they would know they had left the paddock when they crossed a barrier, a fence, or a moat, or both. He had seen no barriers so far. The girl put her head on his shoulder and twirled her hair in her fingers. Soon she was snoring. Tim trudged alongside. Are you holding up, Tim? Okay, he said. But I think we might be in the Tyrannosaurus. Pretty sure we are.
You going to go into the woods? Tim said as they came closer. The woods seemed dark.
Yes, Grant said. I think we can navigate by the numbers and the motion. The motion sensors were green boxes at about 4 feet off the ground. Some were freestanding, most were attached to trees. None of them were working because apparently the power was still off. Each sensor box had a glass lens mounted in the center and a painted code beneath that. A Up ahead in the mist-streaked moonlight, Grant could see a box marked T/S/04. They entered the forest. Huge trees loomed on all sides. In the moonlight, a low mist clung to the ground, curling around the roots of the trees. It was beautiful, but it made walking treacherous. And Grant was watching the sensors. They seemed to be numbered in descending order. He passed T/S/03 and T/S/02. Eventually, they reached T/S/01. He was tired from carrying the girl, and he had hoped this would coincide with a boundary on his pack. It was just another box. The next box after that was marked T/N/01, followed by T/N/02. Grant realized the numbers must be arranged geographically around a central point like a compass. They were going from south to north, so the numbers got smaller as they approached the center, then got larger again. At least we're going the right way, Tim said. Good for you, Grant said. Tim smiled and stumbled over vines in the mist. He got quickly to his feet. They walked on for a while. My parents are getting a divorce, he said. Uh-huh, Grant said. My dad moved out last month. He has his own place in Mill Valley now. Uh-huh. He never carries my sister anymore. He never even picks her up. And he says you have dinosaurs on the brain, Grant said. Tim sighed. Yeah. You miss him? Grant said. Not really, Tim said. Sometimes. She misses him more. Who, your mother? No, Lex. My mom has a boyfriend. She knows him from work. They walked in silence for a while, passing T/N/03 and T/N/04. Have you met him? Grant said. Yeah. How is he? He's okay, Tim said. He's younger than my dad, but he's bald. How does he treat you? I don't know. Okay. I think he just tries to get on my good side. I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes my mom says we'll have to sell the house and move. Sometimes he and my mom fight late at night. I sit in my room and play with my computer, but I can still hear it. Uh-huh, Grant said. Are you divorced? No, Grant said. My wife died a long time ago. And now you're with Dr. Sattler? Grant smiled in the darkness. No, she's my student. You mean she's still in school? Graduate school, yes. Grant paused long enough to shift Lex to his other shoulder, and then they continued on, past T/N/05 and T/N/06. There was the rumble of thunder in the distance, the storm that moved to the south. There was very little sound in the forest except for the drone of cicadas and the soft croaking of tree frogs. Do you have children? Tim asked. No. Are you going to marry Dr. Sattler? No, she's marrying a nice doctor in Chicago sometime next year. Oh, Tim said. He seemed surprised to hear it. They walked along for a while. Who are you going to marry? I don't think I'm going to marry anybody, Grant said. Me neither, Tim said. They walked for a while. Tim said, Are we going to walk all night? I don't think I can, Grant said. We'll have to stop, at least for a few hours. He glanced at his watch. We're okay. We've got almost 15 hours before we have to be back, before the ship reaches the mainland. Where are we going to stop? Tim asked immediately. Grant was wondering the same thing. His first thought was that they might climb a tree and sleep up there. But they would have to climb very high to get safely away from the animals, and Lex might fall out when she was asleep. The tree branches were hard. They wouldn't get any rest, at least he would. They needed someplace really safe. He thought back to the plans he had seen on the jet coming down. He remembered that there were outlying buildings for each of the different divisions. Grant didn't know what they were like because plans for the individual buildings weren't included, and he couldn't remember exactly where they were. But he remembered they were scattered all around the park. There might be buildings somewhere nearby. But that was a different requirement from simply crossing a barrier and getting out of the Tyrannosaurus. Finding a building meant a search strategy of some kind, and the best strategies were... Tim, can you hold your sister for me? I'm going to climb a tree and have a look around. High in the branches, he had a good view of the forest, the tops of the trees extending away to his left and right. They were surprisingly near the edge of the forest. Directly ahead, the trees ended before a clearing with an electrified fence and a pale concrete moat. Beyond that, a large open field, in what he assumed was the sauropod paddock. In the distance, more trees, misty moonlight sparkling on the ocean. Somewhere he heard the bellowing of a dinosaur, but it was far away. He put on Tim's night vision goggles and looked again. He followed the gray curve of the moat, and then saw what he was looking for, the dark strip of a service road leading to the flat rectangle of the roof. The roof was barely above ground level, but it was there, and it wasn't far, maybe a quarter of a mile or so from the tree. When he came back down, Lex was sniffling. "What's the matter?"
I heard an aminal.
"It won't bother us. You will wake up. Come on." He led her to the fence. It was 12 feet high, with a spiral of barbed wire at the top. It seemed to stretch far above them in the moonlight. The moat was immediately on the other side. Lex looked up at the fence doubtfully. "Can you climb it?" Grant asked her. She handed him her glove and her baseball.
Sure. Easy.
He started to climb.
But I bet Timmy can't.
Tim spun in fury. "You shut up!"
Timmy's afraid of heights.
"I am not." She climbed higher.
Are so.
"Am not."
Then come and get me.
Grant turned to Tim, pale in the darkness. The boy wasn't moving. "You okay with the fence, Tim?"
Sure.
"Want some help?"
Timmy's a fraidy cat.
Lex called. "What a stupid jerk," Tim said, and he started to climb.
It's freezing,
Lex said. They were standing waist-deep in smelly water at the bottom of the deep concrete moat. They'd climbed the fence without incident, except that Tim had torn his shirt on the coils of barbed wire at the top. Then they had all slid down into the moat, and now Grant was looking for a way out.
At least I got Timmy over the fence for you, Lex said. He really is scared most of the time. Thanks for your help,
Tim said sarcastically. In the moonlight, he could see floating lumps on the surface. He moved along the moat, looking at the concrete wall on the far side. The concrete was smooth. Impossible to climb it.
Ew,
Lex said, pointing to the water. "It won't hurt you." Grant finally found a place where the concrete had cracked and a vine grew down toward the water. He tugged on the vine, and it held his weight. "Let's go, kids." They started to climb the vine back to the field above. It took only a few minutes to cross the field to the embankment leading to the below-grade service road and the maintenance building off to the right. They passed 2 motion sensors, and Grant noticed with some uneasiness the sensors were still not working, nor were the lights. More than 2 hours had passed since the power first went out, and it was not yet restored. Somewhere in the distance they heard the Tyrannosaurus roar.
Is he around here?
Grant said. "No," Grant said. "We're in another section of park from here." They slid down the grassy embankment and moved toward the concrete building. In the darkness, it was forbidding, bunker-like.
What is this place?
Lex said. "It's safe," Grant said, hoping that was true. The entrance gate was large enough to drive a truck through. It was fitted with heavy bars. Inside, they could see the building was an open shed with piles of grass and bales of hay stacked among equipment. The gate was locked with a heavy padlock. As Grant was examining it, Lex slipped sideways between the bars.
Come on, you guys.
Tim followed her.
I think you can do it, Dr. Grant.
He was right. It was a tight squeeze, but Grant was able to ease his body between the bars and get into the shed. As soon as he was inside, a wave of exhaustion struck him.
I wonder if there's anything to eat,
Lex said. "Just hay." Grant broke open a bale and spread it around on the concrete. The hay in the center was warm. They lay down, feeling the warmth. Lex curled up beside him and closed her eyes. Tim put his arm around her. He heard the sauropods trumpeting softly in the distance. Neither child spoke. They were almost immediately snoring. Grant raised his arm to look at his watch, but it was too dark to see. He felt the warmth of the children against his own body. Grant closed his eyes and slept. Control. Muldoon and Gennaro came into the control room just as Arnold clapped his hands and said, "Got you, you little son of a bitch!" "What is it?" Gennaro said. Arnold pointed to the screen where arrows pointed to 4 more lines of code. Arrow on Feeney.object link set security perimeter. Arrow on Feeney.object call link.sst security perimeter set to on. Arrow on Feeney.object set link.sst security perimeter restore. Arrow on Feeney.object delete line rf white underscore rabbit.object Feeney.object. "That's it," Arnold said, pleased. "That's what?" Gennaro asked, staring at the screen. "I finally found the command to restore the original code. The command called Feeney.object resets the linked parameters, namely the fence and the power." "Good," Muldoon said. "But it does something else," Arnold said. "It then erases the code lines that refer to it. It destroys all evidence it was ever there." "Pretty slick." Gennaro shook his head. "I don't know much about computers." Although he knew enough to know what it meant when a high-tech company went back to the source code, it meant big, big problems. "Well, watch this," Arnold said, and he typed in the command Feeney.object. The screen flickered and immediately changed. Muldoon pointed to the windows. "Look!" Outside, the big quartz lights were coming on throughout the park. They went to the windows and looked out. "Hot damn," Arnold said. Gennaro said, "Does this mean the electrified fences are back on?" "You bet it does," Arnold said. "It'll take a few seconds to get up to full power because we've got 50 miles of fence out there and the generator has to charge the capacitors along the way. But in half a minute, we'll be back in business." Arnold pointed to the vertical glass see-through map of the park. On the map, bright red lines were snaking out from the power station, moving throughout the park as electricity surged through the fences. "And the motion sensors?" Gennaro said. "Yes, them too. It'll be a few minutes while the computer counts, but everything's working," Arnold said. 9:30, and we've got the whole damn thing back up and running." Grant opened his eyes. Brilliant blue light was streaming into the building through the bars of the gate. Quartz light. The power was back on. Groggily, he looked at his watch. It was just 9:30. He'd been asleep only a couple of minutes. He decided he could sleep a few minutes more, and then he would go back up to the field and stand in front of the motion sensors and wave, setting them off. The control room would spot him. They'd send a car out to pick him and the kids up. He'd tell Arnold to recall the supply ship, and they'd all finish the night in their own beds back in the lodge. He would do that right away. In just a couple of minutes, he yawned and closed his eyes again. "Not bad," Arnold said in the control room, staring at the glowing map. "There's only 3 cutouts in the whole park. Much better than I hoped for." "Cutouts?" Gennaro said. "The fence automatically cuts out short-circuited sections," he explained. "You can see a big one here in Sector 12, near the main road." "That's where the wrecks knocked the fence down," Muldoon said. "Exactly. And another one is here in Sector 11, near the sauropod maintenance building." "Why would that section be out?" Gennaro said. "God knows," Arnold said. "Probably storm damage, or a fallen tree. We can check it on the monitor in a while. The third one is over there by the Jungle River. Don't know why that should be out either." As Gennaro looked, the map became more complex, filling with green spots and numbers. "What's all this?" "The animals. The motion sensors are working again, and the computer's starting to identify the location of all the animals in the park. And anybody else, too." Gennaro stared at the map. "You mean Grant and the kids?" "Yes. We've reset our search number above 400. So if they're out there moving around," Arnold said, "the motion sensors will pick them up as additional animals." He stared at the map. "But I don't see any additionals yet." "Why does it take so long?" Gennaro said. "You have to realize, Mr. Gennaro," Arnold said, "that there's a lot of extraneous movement out there. Branches blowing in the wind, birds flying around, all kinds of stuff. The computer has to eliminate all the background movement. It may take, Okay, count's finished." Gennaro said, "You don't see the kids?" Arnold twisted in his chair and looked back to the map. No, he said. At the moment, there are no additionals on the map at all. Everything out there has been accounted for as a dinosaur. They're probably up in a tree, or somewhere else where we can't see them. I wouldn't worry yet. Several animals haven't shown up, like the big Rex. That's probably because it's sleeping somewhere and not moving. The people may be sleeping too, we just don't know. Muldoon shook his head. We better get on with it, he said. We need to repair the fences and get the animals back into their paddocks. According to that computer, we got 5 to herd back to the proper paddocks. I'll take the maintenance crews out now. Arnold turned to Gennaro. You may want to see how Dr. Malcolm is doing. Tell Dr. Harding that Muldoon will need him in about an hour to supervise the herding, and I'll notify Mr. Hammond that we're starting our final cleanup. Gennaro passed through the iron gates and went in the front door of the safari lodge. He saw Ellie Sattler coming down the hallway carrying towels and a pan of steaming water. There's a kitchen at the other end, she said. We're using that to boil water for the dressing. How is he? Gennaro asked. Surprisingly good, she said. Gennaro followed Ellie down to Malcolm's room and was startled to hear the sound of laughter. The mathematician lay on his back in the bed with Harding adjusting an IV line. So the other man says, I'll tell you frankly, I didn't like it, Bill. I went back to toilet paper. Harding was laughing. It's not bad, is it? Malcolm said, smiling. Ah, Mr. Gennaro. You've come to see me. Now you know what happens from trying to get a leg up on the situation. Gennaro came in tentatively. Harding said, he's on fairly high doses of morphine. Not high enough, I can tell you, Malcolm said. Mighty stingy with the drug. Did they find the others yet? No, not yet, Gennaro said, but I'm glad to see you doing so well. How else should I be doing, Malcolm said, with a compound fracture of the leg that is likely septic and beginning to smell rather, pungent? But I always say if you can't keep a sense of humor... Gennaro smiled. Do you remember what happened? Of course I remember, Malcolm said. Do you think you could be bitten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex and it would escape your mind? No, indeed, I'll tell you, you'll remember it for the rest of your life. In my case, perhaps not a terribly long time, but still, yes, I remember. Malcolm described running from the Land Cruiser in the rain and being chased down by the Rex. It was my own man's fault. He was too quick, but I was panicked. In case he picked me up in his jaws. How? Gennaro said. Torso, Malcolm said to his shirt. A broad semicircle of bruised marks ran from his shoulder to his navel. Lifted me up in his jaws, shook me bloody hard, and threw me down. And I was fine. Terrified, of course, but still and all fine. Right up to the moment he threw me. I broke the leg in the fall. But the bite was not half bad. He sighed, considering. Harding said, most of the big carnivores don't have strong jaws. The real power is in the neck musculature. The jaws just hold on while they use the neck to twist and rip. But with a small creature like Dr. Malcolm, the animal would just shake him and then toss him. I'm afraid that's right, Malcolm said. I doubt I'd have survived except the big chap's heart wasn't in it. To tell the truth, he struck me as a rather clumsy attacker of anything less than an automobile or a small apartment building. You think he attacked half-heartedly? It pains me to say it, Malcolm said, but I don't honestly feel I had his full attention. He had mine, of course, but then he weighs 8 tons. I don't. Gennaro turned to Harding and said, they're going to repair the fences now. Arnold says Muldoon will need your help herding animals. Okay, Arnold said. So long as you leave me Dr. Sattler and ample morphine, Malcolm said, and so long as we do not have a Malcolm effect here. What's a Malcolm effect, Gennaro said. Modesty forbids me, Malcolm said, from telling you the details of a phenomenon named after him. He sighed again and closed his eyes. In a moment, he was sleeping. Ellie walked out into the hallway with Gennaro. Don't be fooled, she said. It's a great strain on him. When will you have a helicopter? A helicopter? He needs surgery on that leg. Make sure they send for a helicopter and get him off this island. the park. The portable generators sputtered and roared to life, and the quartz floodlights glowed at the ends of their telescoping arms. Muldoon heard the soft gurgle of the jungle river a few yards to the north. He turned back to the maintenance van and saw one of the workmen coming out with a big power saw. No, he said, just the ropes, Carlos. We don't need to cut it. He turned back to look at the fence. They had difficulty finding the shortened section at first because there wasn't much to see. A small protocarpus tree was leaning against the fence. It was one of several that had been planted in this region of the park, their feathery branches intended to conceal the fence from view. But this particular tree had been tied down with guy wires and turnbuckles. The wires had broken free in the storm, and the metal turnbuckles had blown against the fence and shorted it out. Of course, none of this should have happened. Grounds crews were supposed to use plastic-coated wires and ceramic turnbuckles near fences, but it had happened anyway. In any case, it wasn't going to be a big job. All they had to do was pull the tree off the fence, remove the metal fittings, and mark it for the gardeners to fix in the morning. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes. And that was just as well, because Muldoon knew the Dilophosaurs always stayed close to the river. Even though the workmen were separated from the river by the fence, the Dillos could spit right through it, delivering their blinding poison. Ramon, one of the workmen, came over. "Senor Muldoon," he said, "did you see the lights?" "What lights?" Muldoon said. Ramon pointed to the east through the jungle. "I saw it as we were coming out. It is there, very faint. You see it? It looks like the lights of a car, but it is not moving." Muldoon squinted. It probably was just a maintenance light. After all, power was back on. "We'll worry about it later," he said. "Right now, let's just get that tree off the fence." Arnold was in an expansive mood. The park was almost back in order. Muldoon was repairing the fences. Hammond had gone off to supervise the transfer of the animals with Harding. Although he was tired, Arnold was feeling good. He was even in a mood to indulge the lawyer, Gennaro. "The Malcolm effect?" Arnold said. "You worried about that?" "I'm just curious," Gennaro said. "You mean you want me to tell you why Ian Malcolm is wrong?" "Sure." Arnold lit another cigarette. "It's technical." "Try me." "Okay," Arnold said. "Chaos theory describes nonlinear systems. It's now become a very broad theory. It's been used to study everything from the stock market to heart rhythms. A very fashionable theory. Very trendy to apply it to any complex system where there might be unpredictability. Okay?" "Okay," Gennaro said. Ian Malcolm is a mathematician specializing in chaos theory. Quite amusing and personable, but basically what he does, besides wear black, is use computers to model the behavior of complex systems. And John Hammond loves the latest scientific fad, so he asked Malcolm to model the system at Jurassic Park, which Malcolm did. Malcolm's models are all face-space shapes on a computer screen. Have you seen them? "No," Gennaro said. "Well, they look like a weird, twisted ship's propeller. According to Malcolm, the behavior of any system follows the surface of the propeller. You with me?" "Not exactly," Gennaro said. Arnold held his hand in the air. "Let's say I put a drop of water on the back of my hand. That drop is going to run off my hand. Maybe it'll run toward my wrist. Maybe it'll run toward my thumb, or down between my fingers. I don't know for sure where it will go, but I know it will run somewhere along the surface of my hand. It has to." "Okay," Gennaro said. "Chaos theory treats the behavior of a whole system like a drop of water moving on a complicated propeller surface. The drop may spiral down or slip outward toward the edge. It may do many different things, depending, but it will always move along the surface of the propeller." "Okay." Malcolm's models tend to have a ledge or a sharp incline where the drop of water will speed up greatly. He modestly calls this speeding up movement the Malcolm effect. The whole system could suddenly collapse. And that was what he said about Jurassic Park, that it had inherent instability. "Inherent instability," Gennaro said. "And what did you do when you got his report?" "We disagreed with it and ignored it, of course," Arnold said. Was that why? It's self-evident, Arnold said. We're dealing with living systems, after all. This is life, not computer models. In the harsh quartz lights, the Hypsilophodont's green head hung down out of the sling, the tongue dangling, the eyes dull. "Careful! Careful!" Hammond shouted as the crane began to lift. Harding grunted and eased the head back onto the leather straps. He didn't want to impede circulation through the carotid artery. The crane hissed as it lifted the animal into the air onto the waiting flatbed truck. The Hipsy was a small dryosaur, 7 feet long, weighing about 500 pounds. She was dark green with mottled brown spots. She was breathing slowly, but she seemed all right. Harding had shot her a few minutes before with a tranquilizer gun, and apparently he had guessed the correct dose. There was always a tense moment dosing these big animals. Too little and they would run off into the forest, collapsing where you couldn't get to them. Too much and they went into terminal cardiac arrest. This one had taken a single bounding leap and keeled over, perfectly dosed. "Watch it! Easy!" Hammond was shouting to the workmen. "Mr. Hammond," Harding said, "please." "Well, they should be careful." "They are being careful," Harding said. He climbed up onto the back of the flatbed as the Hipsy came down, and he set her into the restraining harness. Harding slipped on the cardiogram collar that monitored heartbeat, then picked up the big electronic thermometer the size of a turkey baster and slipped it into the rectum. It beeped, 96.2 degrees. "How is she?" Hammond asked fretfully. "She's fine," Harding said. "She's only dropped 1.5 degrees." "That's too much," Hammond said. "Too deep. You don't want her waking up and jumping off the truck," Harding snapped. Before coming to the park, Harding had been the chief of veterinary medicine at the San Diego Zoo, the world's leading expert on avian care. He flew all over the world, consulting with zoos in Europe, India, and Japan on the care of exotic birds. He'd had no interest when this peculiar little man showed up, offering him a position in a private game park. But when he learned what Hammond had done, it was impossible to pass up. Harding had an academic bent, and the prospect of writing the first textbook of veterinary internal medicine, Diseases of Dinosauria, was compelling. In the late 20th century, veterinary medicine was scientifically advanced. The best zoos ran clinics little different from hospitals. New textbooks were merely refinements of old. For a world-class practitioner, there were no worlds left to conquer. But to be the first to care for a whole new class of animals, that was something. And Harding had never regretted his decision. He had developed considerable expertise with these animals, and he didn't want to hear from Hammond now. The Hipsy snorted and twitched. He was still breathing shallowly. There was no ocular reflex yet, but it was time to get moving. "All aboard," Harding shouted. "Let's get this girl back to her paddock." Living systems, Harding said, are not like mechanical systems. Living systems are never in equilibrium. They are inherently unstable. They may seem stable, but they're not. Everything is moving and changing. In a sense, everything is on the edge of collapse. Gennaro was frowning. But lots of things don't change. Body temperature doesn't change, all kinds of other... Body temperature changes constantly, Arnold said. Constantly. It changes cyclically over 24 hours, lowest in the morning, highest in the afternoon. It changes with mood, with disease, with exercise, with outside temperature, with food. It continuously fluctuates up and down, tiny jiggles on a graph. Because at any moment, some forces are pushing temperature up, or other forces are pulling it down. It is inherently unstable. And every other aspect of living systems is like that too. So you're saying Malcolm's just another theoretician, Arnold said. Sitting in his office, he made a nice mathematical model, and it never occurred to him that what he saw as defects were actually necessities. Look, when I was working on missiles, we dealt with something called resonant yaw. Resonant yaw meant that even though a missile was only slightly unstable off the pad, it was hopeless. It was inevitably going to go out of control, and it couldn't be brought back. That's a feature of mechanical systems. A little wobble can get worse until the whole system collapses. But those same little wobbles are essential to a living system. They mean the system is healthy and responsive. Malcolm never understood that. Are you sure he didn't understand that? It seems pretty clear on the difference between living and non-living. Look, Arnold said. The proof is right here. He pointed to the screen. In less than an hour, he said, the park will be all back online. The only thing I've got left to clear is a telephone. For some reason, they're still out. But everything else will be working. Now, that's not theoretical, that's a fact. The needle went deep into the neck, and Harding injected the Medrine into the anesthetized female Dryosaur as she lay on her side on the ground. Immediately, the animal began to recover, snorting and kicking her powerful hind legs. "Back, everybody," Harding said, scrambling away. "Get back." The dinosaur staggered to her feet, standing drunkenly. She shook her lizard head, stared at the people standing back in the quartz lights, and blinked. "She's drooling," Hammond said, worried. "Temporary," Harding said. "It'll stop." The Dryosaur coughed and then moved slowly across the field, away from the lights. "Why isn't she hopping?" "She will," Harding said. "It'll take her about an hour to recover fully. She's fine." He turned back to the car. "Okay, boys, let's go deal with the stego." Muldoon watched as the last of the stakes was pounded into the ground. The lines were pulled taut, and the protocarpus tree was lifted clear. Muldoon could see the blackened, charred streaks on the silver fence where the short had occurred. At the base of the fence, several ceramic insulators had burst. They would have to be replaced. But before that could be done, Arnold would have to shut down all the fences. "Control, this is Muldoon. We're ready to begin repair." "All right," Arnold said. "Shutting out your section now." Muldoon glanced at his watch. Somewhere in the distance, he heard soft hooting. It sounded like owls, but he knew it was the Dilophosaurs. He went over to Ramon and said, "Let's finish this up. I want to get to those other sections of fence." An hour went by. Donald Gennaro stared at the glowing map in the control room as the spots and numbers flickered and changed. "What's happening now?" Arnold worked at the console. "I'm trying to get the phones back so we can call about Malcolm." "No, I mean out there." Arnold glanced up at the board. "It looks as if they're about done with the animals and the two sections. Just as I told you, the park is back in hand, with no catastrophic Malcolm effect. In fact, there's just that third section of fence." "Arnold!" It was Muldoon's voice. "Yes? Have you seen this bloody fence?" "Just a minute." On one of the monitors, Gennaro saw a high angle down on a field of grass blowing in the wind. In the distance was a low concrete roof. "That's the sauropod maintenance building," Arnold explained. "It's one of the utility structures we use for equipment, feed storage, and so on. We have them all around the park, in each of the paddocks." On the monitor, the video image panned. "We're turning the camera now to get a look at the fence." Gennaro saw a shining wall of metallic mesh in the light. One section had been trampled, knocked flat. Muldoon's jeep and work crew were there. "Huh," Arnold said. "Looks like the Rex went into the sauropod paddock." Muldoon said, "Fine dining tonight." "We'll have to get him out of there," Arnold said. "With what?" Muldoon said. "We haven't got anything to use on a Rex. I'll fix this fence, but I'm not going in there until daylight." "Hammond won't like it." "We'll discuss it when I get back," Muldoon said. "How many sauropods will the Rex kill?" Hammond said, pacing around the control room. "Probably just one," Harding said. "Sauropods are big. The Rex can feed off a single kill for several days." "We have to go out and get him tonight," Hammond said. Muldoon shook his head. "I'm not going in there until daylight." Hammond was rising up and down on the balls of his feet, the way he did whenever he was angry. "Are you forgetting you work for me?" "No, Mr. Hammond, I'm not forgetting. But that's a full-grown adult Tyrannosaur out there. How do you plan to get him?" "We have tranquilizer guns." "We have tranquilizer guns that shoot a 20cc dart," Muldoon said. "Fine for an animal that weighs 400 or 500 pounds. That Tyrannosaur weighs 8 tons. It wouldn't even feel it." "You ordered a larger weapon?" "I ordered 3 larger weapons, Mr. Hammond, but you cut the requisition, so we only got 1. And it's gone. Nedry took it when he left." "That was pretty stupid. Who let that happen?" "Nedry's not my problem, Mr. Hammond," he said. "You're saying," Hammond said, that as of this moment, there is no way to stop the Tyrannosaur? That's exactly what I'm saying, Muldoon said. That's ridiculous, Hammond said. It's your park, Mr. Hammond. You didn't want anybody to be able to injure your precious dinosaurs. Well, now you've got a Rex in with the sauropods, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. He left the room. Just a minute, Hammond said, hurrying after him. Gennaro stared at the screens and listened to the shouted argument in the hallway outside. He said to Arnold, I guess you don't have control of the park yet, after all. Don't kid yourself, Arnold said, lighting another cigarette. We have the park. It'll be dawn in a couple of hours. We may lose a couple of dinos before we get the Rex out of there, but believe me, we have the park. Dawn. Grant was awakened by a loud grinding noise, followed by a mechanical clanking. He opened his eyes and saw a bale of hay rolling past him on a conveyor belt up toward the ceiling. 2 more bales followed it. Then the clanking stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and the concrete building was silent again. Grant yawned. He stretched sleepily, winced in pain, and sat up. Soft yellow light came through the side windows. It was morning. He had slept the whole night. He looked quickly at his watch. 5 a.m. Still almost 6 hours to go before the boat had to be recalled. He rolled onto his back, groaning. His head throbbed and his body ached as if he had been beaten up. From around the corner, he heard a squeaking sound like a rusty wheel, and then Lex giggling. Grant stood slowly and looked at the building. Now that it was daylight, he could see it was some kind of maintenance building with stacks of hay and supplies. On the wall, he saw a gray metal box and a stenciled sign, Sauropod Maintenance Building 04. This must be the sauropod paddock, as he had thought. He opened the box and saw a telephone. But when he lifted the receiver, he heard only hissing static. Apparently, the phones weren't working yet.
Chew your food, Lex was saying. Don't be a piggy, Ralph.
Grant walked around the corner and found Lex by the bars, holding out handfuls of hay to an animal outside that looked like a large pink pig, and was making the squeaking sounds Grant had heard. It was actually an infant triceratops about the size of a pony. The infant didn't have horns on its head yet, just a curved, bony frill behind big, soft eyes. It poked its snout through the bars toward Lex, its eyes watching her as she fed it more hay.
That's better, Lex said. There's plenty of hay, don't worry.
He patted the baby on the head.
You like hay, don't you, Ralph?
Lex turned back and saw him.
This is Ralph, Lex said. He's my friend. He likes hay.
Grant took a step and stopped, wincing.
You look pretty bad, Lex said.
I feel pretty bad.
Tim, too. His nose is all swollen up.
Where is Tim?
Peeing, she said. You want to help me feed Ralph?
The baby triceratops looked at Grant. Hay stuck out of both sides of its mouth, dropping on the floor as it chewed.
He's a very messy eater, Lex said, and he's very hungry.
The baby finished chewing and licked its lips. It opened its mouth, waiting for more. Grant could see the slender, sharp teeth and the beaky upper jaw like a parrot.
Okay, just a minute, Lex said,
scooping up more straw from the concrete floor.
Honestly, Ralph, she said, you'd think your mother never fed you.
Why is his name Ralph?
Because he looks like Ralph at school.
Grant came closer and touched the skin of the neck gently.
It's okay, you can pet him, Lex said. He likes it when you pet him, don't you, Ralph?
The skin felt dry and warm, with the pebbled texture of a football. Ralph gave a little squeak as Grant petted it. Outside the bars, its thick tail swung back and forth with pleasure.
He's pretty tame.
Ralph looked from Lex to Grant as it ate and showed no sign of fear. It reminded Grant that the dinosaurs didn't have ordinary responses to people.
Maybe I can ride him, Lex said.
Let's not.
I bet he'd let me, Lex said. It'd be fun to ride a dinosaur.
Grant looked out the bars past the animal to the open fields of the sauropod compound. It was growing lighter every minute. He should go outside, he thought, and set off one of the motion sensors on the field above. After all, it might take the people in the control room an hour to get out here to him. and he didn't like the idea that the phones were still down. He heard a deep snorting sound, like the snort of a very large horse, and suddenly the baby became agitated. It tried to pull its head back through the bars, but got caught on the edge of its frill, and it squeaked in fright. The snorting came again. It was closer this time. Ralph reared up on its hind legs, frantic to get out from between the bars. It wriggled its head back and forth, rubbing against the bars.
Ralph, take it easy,
Lex said. Push him out, Grant said. He reached up to Ralph's head and leaned against it, pushing the animal sideways and backward. The frill popped free, and the baby fell outside the bars, losing its balance and flopping on its side. Then the baby was covered in shadow, and a huge leg came into view, thicker than a tree trunk. The foot had 5 curved toenails like an elephant's. Ralph looked up and squeaked. A head came down into view, 6 feet long, with 3 long white horns, one above each of the large brown eyes, and a smaller horn at the tip of the nose. It was a full-grown triceratops. The big animal peered at Lex and Grant, blinking slowly, and then turned its attention to Ralph. A tongue came out and licked the baby. Ralph squeaked and rubbed up against the big leg.
Is that his mom?
Lex said. Looks like it, Grant said.
Should we eat the mom too?
Lex said. But the big triceratops was already nudging Ralph with her snout, pushing the baby away from the bars. Guess not. The infant turned away from the bars and walked off. From time to time, the big mother nudged her baby, guiding it away as they both walked out into the fields. Goodbye, Ralph, Lex said, waving. Tim came out of the shadows of the building. Tell you what, Grant said, I'm going up on the hill to set off the motion sensors so they'll know to come get us. You two stay here and wait for me.
No.
Lex said. Why? Stay here. It's safe here.
You're not leaving us, she said. Right, Timmy?
Right, Tim said. Okay, Grant said. They crawled through the bars, stepping outside. It was just before dawn. The air was warm and humid. The sky soft pink and purple. White mist clung low to the ground. Some distance away, they saw the mother triceratops and the baby moving away toward a herd of large duck-billed hadrosaurs, eating foliage from trees at the edge of the lagoon. Some of the hadrosaurs stood knee-deep in the water. They drank, lowering their flat heads, meeting their own reflection in the still water. Then they looked up again, their heads swiveling. At the water's edge, one of the babies ventured out, squeaked, scrambled back while the adults watched indulgently. Farther south, other hadrosaurs were eating the lower vegetation. Sometimes they reared up on their hind legs, resting their forelegs on the tree trunk so they could reach the leaves on higher branches. And in the far distance, a giant apatosaur stood above the trees, with tiny head swiveling on the long neck. The scene was so peaceful, Grant found it hard to imagine any danger. Yow! Lex shouted, ducking. 2 giant red dragonflies with 6-foot wingspans hopped past them.
What was that?
Dragonflies, he said. The Jurassic was a time of huge insects.
Do they bite?
Lex said. I don't think so, Grant said. Tim held out his hand. One of the dragonflies
He's gonna bite you.
But the dragonfly just slowly flapped its red-veined, transparent wings, and then, when Tim moved his arm, flew off again.
Which way do we go?
He said. There. They started walking across the field. They reached a black box mounted on a heavy metal tripod, the first of the motion sensors. Grant stopped and waved his hand in front of it, back and forth, but nothing happened. If the phones didn't work, perhaps the sensors didn't work either. We'll try another one, he said, pointing across the field. Somewhere in the distance, they heard the roar of a large animal. Ah, hell, Arnold said. I just can't find it. He sipped coffee and stared, bleary-eyed, at the screen. He had taken all the video monitors offline. In the control room, he was searching the computer code. He was exhausted. He'd been working for 12 straight hours. He turned to Wu, who would come up from the lab. Find what? The phones are still out. I can't get them back on. I think Nedry did something to the phones. Wu lifted one phone, heard hissing. Sounds like a modem. But it's not, Arnold said, because I went down into the basement and shut off all the modems. What you're hearing is just white noise that sounds like a modem transmitting. So the phone lines are jammed? Basically, yes. Nedry jammed them very well. He's inserted some kind of a lockout into the program code, and now I can't find it. Because I gave that restore command which erased part of the program listings. But apparently the command to shut off the phones is still resident in the computer memory. Wu shrugged. So, just reset. Shut the system down and you'll clear memory. I've never done it before, Arnold said, and I'm reluctant to do it. Maybe all the systems will come back on startup, but maybe they won't. I'm not a computer expert, and neither are you. Not really. And without an open phone line, we can't talk to anybody who is. If the command is RAM resident, it won't show up in the code. You can do a RAM dump and search that, but you don't know what you're searching for. I think all you can do is reset. Gennaro stormed in. We still don't have any telephones. Working on it. You've been working on it since midnight. And Malcolm is worse. He needs medical attention. It means I'll have to shut down, Arnold said. I can't be sure everything will come back on. Gennaro said, look, there's a sick man over in that lodge. He needs a doctor or he'll die. You can't call for a doctor unless you have a phone. 4 people have probably died already. Now shut down and get the phones working. Arnold hesitated. Well, Gennaro said, well, it's just... the safety systems don't allow the computer to be shut down, and then turn the goddamn safety systems off. Can't you get it through your head that he's gonna die unless he gets help? Okay, Arnold said. He got up and went to the main panel. He opened the doors and uncovered the metal swing latches over the safety switches. He popped them off, one after another. You asked for it, Arnold said, and you got it. He threw the master switch. The control room was dark. All the monitors were black. The 3 men stood there in the dark. How long do we have to wait? Gennaro said. 30 seconds, Arnold said. P.U., Lex said as they crossed the field. What? Grant said. That smell, Lex said. It stinks like rotten garbage. Grant hesitated. He stared across the field toward the distant trees, looking for movement. He saw nothing. There was hardly a breeze to stir the branches. It was peaceful and silent in the morning. I think it's your imagination, he said. It's not. Then he heard the honking sound. It came from the herd of duck-billed hadrosaurs behind them. First one animal, then another and another, until the whole herd had taken up the honking cry. The duckbills were agitated, twisting and turning, hurrying out of the water, circling the young ones to protect them. They smell it too, Grant thought. With a roar, the tyrannosaur burst from the trees 50 yards away near the lagoon. It rushed out across the open field with huge strides. It ignored them, heading toward the herd of hadrosaurs. I told you, Lex screamed. Nobody listens to me. In the distance, the duckbills were honking and starting to run. Grant could feel the earth shake. Come on, kids. He grabbed Lex, lifting her bodily off the ground, and ran with him to the grass. He had glimpses of the tyrannosaur down by the lagoon, lunging at the hadrosaurs, which swung their big tails in defense and honked loudly continuously. He heard the crashing of foliage and trees, and when he looked over again, the duckbills were charging. In the darkened control room, Arnold checked his watch. 30 seconds. The memory should be cleared by now. He pushed the main power switch back on. Nothing happened. Arnold's stomach heaved. He pushed the switch off, then on again. Still nothing happened. He felt sweat on his brow. What's wrong? Gennaro said. Oh, hell, Arnold said. Then he remembered you had to turn the safety switches back on before you restarted the power. He flipped on the 3 safeties and covered them again with the latch covers. And he held his breath and turned the main power switch. The room lights came on. The computer beeped. The screens hummed. Thank God, Arnold said. He hurried to the main monitor. Below the heading Jurassic Park System Startup, there were rows of labels on the screen. Gennaro reached for the phone, but it was dead. No static hissing this time, just nothing at all. What's this?
Six and a bit.
Give me a second, Arnold said. After a reset, all the system modules have to be brought online manually. Quickly, he went back to work. Why manually? Gennaro said. Will you just let me work, for Christ's sake? Wu said, the system is not intended to ever shut down, so if it does shut down, it assumes that there is a problem somewhere. It requires you to start up everything manually. Otherwise, if there were a short somewhere, the system would start up, short out, start up again, short out again, in an endless cycle. Okay, Arnold said, we're going. Gennaro picked up the phone and started to dial when he suddenly stopped. Jesus, look at that, he said. He pointed to one of the video monitors. But Arnold wasn't listening, staring at the map, where a tight cluster of dots by the lagoon had started to move in a coordinated way, moving fast, in a kind of swirl. What's happening? Gennaro said. The duckbills, Arnold said, tonelessly. They've stampeded. The duckbills charged with surprising speed, their enormous bodies in a tight cluster, honking and roaring, the infants squealing and trying to stay out from underfoot. The herd raised a great cloud of yellow dust. Grant couldn't see the tyrannosaur. The duckbills were running right toward them. Still carrying Lex, he ran with Tim toward a rocky outcrop with a stand of big conifers. They ran hard, feeling the ground shake beneath their feet. The sound of the approaching herd was deafening, like the sound of jets at an airport. It filled the air and hurt their ears. Lex was shouting something, but he couldn't hear what she was saying, and as they scrambled onto the rocks, the herd closed in around them. Grant saw the immense legs of the first hadrosaurs that charged past, each animal weighing 5 tons, and then they were enveloped in a cloud so dense he could see nothing at all. He had the impression of huge bodies, giant limbs, bellowing cries of pain as the animals wheeled and circled. One duckbill struck a boulder and it rolled past them, out into the field beyond. In the dense cloud of dust, they could see almost nothing beyond the rocks. They clung to the boulders, listening to the screams and honks, the menacing roar of the tyrannosaur. Lex dug her fingers into Grant's shoulder. Another hadrosaur slammed its big tail against the rocks, leaving a splash of hot blood. Grant waited until the sounds of the fighting had moved off to the left, and then he pushed the kids to start climbing the largest tree. They climbed swiftly, feeling for the branches as the animals stampeded all around them in the dust. They went up 20 feet, and then Lex clutched at Grant and refused to go farther. Tim was tired too, and Grant thought they were high enough. Through the dust, they could see the broad backs of the animals below as they wheeled and honked. Grant propped himself against the coarse bark of the trunk, coughed in the dust, closed his eyes, and waited. Arnold adjusted the camera as the herd moved away. The dust slowly cleared. He saw that the hadrosaurs had scattered, and the tyrannosaur had stopped running, which could only mean it had made a kill. The tyrannosaur was now near the lagoon. Arnold looked at the video monitor and said, "Better get Muldoon to go out there and see how bad it is." "I'll get him," Gennaro said, and left the room. The park. A faint crackling sound, like a fire in a fireplace. Something warm and wet tickled Grant's ankle. He opened his eyes and saw an enormous beige head. The head tapered to a flat mouth, shaped like the bill of a duck. The eyes, protruding above the flat duckbill, were gentle and soft like a cow's. The duck mouth opened and chewed branches on the limb where Grant was sitting. He saw large, flat teeth in the cheek. The warm lips touched his ankle again as the animal chewed. A duck-billed hadrosaur. He was astonished to see it up close. Not that he was afraid. All the species of duck-billed dinosaurs were herbivorous, and this one acted exactly like a cow. Even though it was huge, its manner was so calm and peaceful, Grant didn't feel threatened. He stayed where he was on the branch, careful not to move, and watched as it ate. The reason Grant was astonished was that he had a proprietary feeling about this animal. It was probably a myosaur from the late Cretaceous in Montana. With John Horner, Grant had been the first to describe the species. Myosaurs had an upcurved lip, which gave them the appearance of smiling. The name meant good mother lizard. Myosaurs were thought to protect their eggs until the babies were born and could take care of themselves. Grant heard an insistent chirping, and the big head swung down. He moved just enough to see the baby hadrosaur scampering around the feet of the adult. The baby was dark beige with black spots. The adult bent her head low to the ground and waited, unmoving, while the baby stood up on its hind legs, resting its front legs on the mother's jaw, and ate the branches that protruded from the side of the mother's mouth. The mother waited patiently until the baby had finished eating and dropped back down to all fours again. Then the big head came back up toward Grant. The hadrosaur continued to eat, just a few feet from him. Grant looked at the two elongated air holes on top of the flat upper bill. Apparently the dinosaur couldn't smell Grant. And even though the left eye was looking right at him, for some reason the hadrosaur didn't react to him. He remembered how the tyrannosaur had failed to see him the previous night. Grant decided on an experiment. He coughed. Instantly the hadrosaur froze, the big head suddenly still, the jaws no longer chewing. Only the eye moved, looking for the source of the sound. Then, after a moment, when there seemed to be no danger, the animal resumed chewing. Amazing, Grant thought. Sitting in his arms, Lex opened her eyes and said,
Hey, what's that?
The hadrosaur trumpeted in alarm, a loud, resonant honk that so startled Lex that she nearly fell out of the tree. The hadrosaur pulled its head away from the branch and trumpeted again. Don't make her mad, Tim said from the branch above. The baby chirped and scurried beneath the mother's legs as the hadrosaur stepped away from the tree. The mother cocked her head and peered inquisitively at the branch where Grant and Lex were sitting. With its upturned, smiling lips, the dinosaur had a comical appearance. Is it dumb? Lex said. No, Grant said. You just surprised her. Well, Lex said, is she going to let us get down or what? The hadrosaur had backed 10 feet away from the tree. She honked again. Grant had the impression she was trying to frighten them away. But the dinosaur didn't really seem to know what to do. She acted confused and uneasy. They waited in silence, and after a minute the hadrosaur approached the branch again, jaws moving in anticipation. She was clearly going to resume eating. Forget it, Lex said. I'm not staying here. She started to climb down the branches. At her movement, the hadrosaur trumpeted in fresh alarm. Grant was amazed. He thought, it really can't see us when we don't move. And after a minute, it literally forgets that we're here. This was just like the tyrannosaur, another classic example of an amphibian visual cortex. Studies of frogs had shown that amphibians only saw moving things like insects. If something didn't move, they literally didn't see it. The same thing seemed to be true of dinosaurs. In any case, the maiasaur now seemed to find these strange creatures climbing down the tree too upsetting. With a final honk, she nudged her baby and lumbered slowly away. She paused once and looked back at them, then continued on. They reached the ground. Lex shook herself off. Both children were covered in a layer of fine dust. All around them, the grass had been flattened. There were streaks of blood and a sour smell. Grant looked at his watch. We better get going, kids, he said. Not me, Lex said. I'm not walking out there anymore. We have to. Why? Because, Grant said, we have to tell them about the boat. Since they can't seem to see us on the motion sensors, we have to go all the way back ourselves. It's the only way. Why can't we take the raft? Tim said. What raft? Tim pointed to the low concrete maintenance building with the bars where they had spent the night. It was 20 yards away across the field. I saw a raft back there, he said. Grant immediately understood the advantages. It was now 7 o'clock in the morning. They had at least 8 miles to go. If they could take a raft along the river, they would make much faster progress than going overland. Let's do it, Grant said. End of Side 8. Side 9. Arnold punched the visual search mode and watched as the monitors began to scan throughout the park, the images changing every 2 seconds. It was tiring to watch, but it was the fastest way to find Nedry's Jeep, and Muldoon had been adamant about that. He'd gone out with Gennaro to look at the stampede, but now that it was daylight, he wanted the car found. He wanted the weapons. His intercom clicked. Mr. Arnold, may I have a word with you, please? It was Hammond. He sounded like the voice of God. You want to come here, Mr. Hammond? No, Mr. Arnold, Hammond said. Come to me. I'm in the genetics lab with Dr. Wu. We'll be waiting for you. Arnold sighed and stepped away from the screens. Grant stumbled deep in the gloomy recesses of the building. He pushed past 5-gallon containers of herbicide, tree pruning equipment, spare tires for a Jeep, coils of cyclone fencing, 100-pound fertilizer bags, stacks of brown ceramic insulators, empty motor oil cans, work lights, and cables. I don't see any raft.
Keep going.
Bags of cement, lengths of copper pipe, green mesh, and 2 plastic oars hung on cliffs of the concrete wall. Okay, he said, but where's the raft?
It must be here somewhere,
Tim said. You never saw a raft?
No, I just assumed it was here.
Poking among the junk, Grant found no raft. But he did find a set of plans rolled up and speckled with mold and humidity, stuck back in a metal cabinet on the wall. He spread the plans on the floor, brushing away a big spider. He looked at them for a long time.
I'm hungry.
Just a minute. They were detailed topographical charts for the main area of the island where they now were. According to this, the lagoon narrowed into the river they had seen earlier, which twisted northward, right through the aviary, and on to within a half-mile of the visitor lodge. He flipped back through the pages. How to get to the lagoon? According to the plans, there should be a door at the back of the building they were in. Grant looked up and saw it, recessed back in the concrete wall. The door was wide enough for a car. Opening it, he saw a paved road running straight down toward the lagoon. The road was dug below ground level, so it couldn't be seen from above. Must be another service road. And it led to a dock at the edge of the lagoon. And clearly stenciled on the dock was raft storage. Hey, Tim said, look at this. He held out a metal case to Grant. Opening it, Grant found a compressed air pistol and a cloth belt that held darts. There were 6 darts in all, each as thick as his finger, labeled Moro 709. Good work, Tim. He slung the belt around his shoulder and stuck the gun in his trousers.
Is it a tranquilizer gun?
I'd say so.
What about the boat?
Lex said. I think it's on the dock, Grant said. They started down the road. Grant carried the oars on his shoulder.
I hope it's a big raft, Lex said, because I can't swim.
Don't worry, he said.
Maybe we can catch some fish,
she said. They walked down the road with a sloping embankment rising up on both sides of them. They heard a deep, rhythmic snorting sound, but Grant could not see where it was coming from.
Are you sure there's a raft down here?
Lex said, wrinkling her nose. Probably, Grant said. The rhythmic snorting became louder as they walked, but they also heard a steady droning, buzzing sound. When they reached the end of the road, at the edge of the small concrete dock, Grant froze in shock. The Tyrannosaur was right there. It was sitting upright in the shade of a tree, its hind legs stretched out in front. Its eyes were open, but it was not moving, except for its head, which lifted and fell gently with each snorting sound. The buzzing came from the clouds of flies that surrounded it, crawling over its face and slack jaws, its bloody fangs, and the red haunch of a killed hadrosaur that lay on its side behind the Tyrannosaur. The Tyrannosaur was only 20 yards away. Grant felt sure it must have seen him, but the big animal did not respond. It just sat there. It took him a moment to realize. The Tyrannosaur was asleep, sitting up, but asleep. He signaled to Tim and Lex to stay where they were. Grant walked slowly forward onto the dock in full view of the Tyrannosaur. The big animal continued to sleep, snoring softly. Near the end of the dock, a wooden shed was painted green to blend with the foliage. Grant quietly unlatched the door and looked inside. He saw a half-dozen orange life vests hanging on the wall, several rolls of wire mesh fencing, some coils of rope, and 2 big rubber cubes sitting on the floor. The cubes were strapped tight with flat rubber belts. Rafts. He looked back at Lex. She mouthed, "No boat." He nodded, "Yes." The Tyrannosaur raised its forelimb to swipe at the flies buzzing around its snout, but otherwise it did not move. Grant pulled one of the cubes out onto the dock. It was surprisingly heavy. He freed the straps, found the inflation cylinder. With a loud hiss, the rubber began to expand, and then with a hiss whap, it popped fully open on the dock. The sound was fearfully loud in their ears. Grant turned, stared up at the dinosaur. The tyrannosaur grunted and snorted. It began to move. Grant braced himself to run, but the animal shifted its ponderous bulk, and then it settled back against the tree trunk and gave a long, growling belch.
For some reason,
Lex looked disgusted, waving her hand in
wherever it's
front of
at,
her face.
I flattened this
Grant
large
was
area.
soaked in
I'm not
sweat
entirely
from the
sure what my
tension.
plans were with
He
it.
dragged the rubber
I
raft
want
across
to
the dock.
say
It
was
flopped into the water with
probably
a
had
loud
something to do
splash.
with a,
The dinosaur continued to sleep.
oh,
Grant
goodness.
tied the boat up to the dock and returned to the shed to take out 2 life preservers. He put these in
It's
the
only
boat
3 p.m.
and then waved for the
How
kids to
am
come
I
out
so
onto the dock.
tired?
Pale with fear, Lex waved back. No. He gestured, yes.
Thinking I'm gonna
The
put a
tyrannosaur
large
continued to sleep.
uh,
Grant stabbed in the air with an emphatic finger.
having
Lex
a brother
came
up
silently, and he gestured for her to get into the raft. Then Tim got in, and they both put on their life vests. Grant got in and pushed off. The raft drifted silently out into the lagoon. Grant picked up his paddles and fitted them into the oarlocks. They moved farther from the dock.
have something
Lex
on
sat
the
back
top
and
of these
sighed
hills,
loudly
so
with
there's
relief.
no point.
Then she looked stricken and put her hand over her mouth. Her body shook with muffled sounds. She was suppressing a cough. She always coughed at the wrong times. Lex! Tim whispered fiercely, looking back toward the shore. She shook her head miserably and pointed to her throat. He knew what she meant, a tickle in her throat. What she needed was a drink of water. Grant was rowing, and Tim leaned over the side of the raft and scooped his hand in the lagoon, holding his cupped hand toward her. Lex coughed loudly, explosively. In Tim's ears, the sound echoed across the water like a gunshot. The tyrannosaur yawned lazily and scratched behind its ear with its hind foot, just like a dog. It yawned again. It was groggy after its big meal, and it woke up slowly. On the boat, Lex was making little gargling sounds. Lex, shut up, Tim said. I can't help it, she whispered, and then she coughed again. Grant rowed hard, moving the raft powerfully into the center of the lagoon. On the shore, the tyrannosaur stumbled to its feet. I couldn't help it, Timmy, Lex shrieked miserably. I couldn't help it. Shh! Grant was rowing as fast as he could. Anyway, it doesn't matter, she said. We're far enough away, he can't swim. Of course he can swim, you little idiot, Tim shouted at her. On the shore, the tyrannosaur stepped off the dock and plunged into the water. It moved strongly into the lagoon after them. Well, how should I know, she said. Everybody knows tyrannosaurs can swim. It's in all the books. Anyway, all reptiles can swim. Snakes can't. Of course snakes can, you idiot. Settle down, Grant said. Hold on to something. Grant was watching the tyrannosaur, noticing how the animal swam. The tyrannosaur was now chest deep in the water, but it could hold its big head high above the surface. Then Grant realized the animal wasn't swimming. It was walking. Because moments later, only the very top of the head, the eyes and nostrils protruded above the surface. By then, it looked like a crocodile, and it swam like a crocodile, swinging its big tail back and forth, so the water churned behind it. Behind the head, Grant saw the hump of the back and the ridges along the length of tail as it occasionally broke the surface. Exactly like a crocodile, he thought unhappily. The biggest crocodile in the world. I'm sorry, Dr. Grant, Lex wailed. I didn't mean it.
Oh, no.
Grant glanced over his shoulder. The lagoon was no more than 100 yards wide here, and they'd almost reached the center. If he continued, the water would become shallow again. The tyrannosaur would be able to walk again, and he would move faster in shallow water. Grant swung the boat around and began to row north. What are you doing? The tyrannosaur was now just a few yards away. Grant could hear its sharp, snorting breaths as it came closer. Grant looked at the paddles in his hands, but they were light plastic, not weapons at all. The tyrannosaur threw its head back and opened its jaws wide, showing rows of curved teeth, and then, in a great muscular spasm, lunged forward to the raft, just missing the rubber gunnel, the huge skull slapping down, the raft rocking away on the crest of the splash. The tyrannosaur sank below the surface, leaving gurgling bubbles. The lagoon was still. Lex gripped the gunnel handles and looked back. Did he drown? No, Grant said. He saw bubbles, then a faint ripple along the surface, coming toward the boat. "Hang on!" he shouted, as the head bucked up beneath the rubber, bending the boat and lifting it into the air, spinning them crazily before it splashed down again.
Do something! Alexis screamed. Do something!
Grant pulled the air pistol out of his belt. It looked pitifully small in his hands, but there was the chance that if he shot the animal in a sensitive spot, in the eye or the nose, the Tyrannosaur surface beside the boat opened its jaws and roared. Grant aimed and fired. The dart flashed in the light and smacked into the cheek. The Tyrannosaur shook its head and roared again, and suddenly they heard an answering roar floating across the water toward them. Looking back, Grant saw the juvenile T-Rex on the shore, crouched over the killed sauropod, claiming the kill as its own. The juvenile slashed at the carcass, then raised its head high and bellowed. The big Tyrannosaur saw it too, and the response was immediate. It turned back to protect its kill, swimming strongly toward the shore.
He's going away!
Lex squealed, clapping her hands.
He's going away! Na 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 na, stupid dinosaur!
From the shore, the juvenile roared defiantly. Enraged, the big Tyrannosaur burst from the lagoon at full speed, water streaming from its enormous body as it raced up the hill past the dock. The juvenile ducked its head and fled, its jaws still filled with ragged flesh. The big Tyrannosaur chased it, racing past the dead sauropod, disappearing over the hill. They heard its final threatening bellow, and then the raft moved to the north, around a bend in the lagoon, to the river. Exhausted from rowing, Grant collapsed back, his chest heaving. He couldn't catch his breath. He lay gasping in the raft.
Are you okay, Dr. Grant?
Lex asked. From now on, will you just do what I tell you?
Okay,
she sighed, as if he had just made the most unreasonable demand in the world. She trailed her arm in the water for a while.
You stopped rowing, she said.
I'm tired, Grant said.
Then how come we're still moving?
Grant sat up. She was right. The raft drifted steadily north. There must be a current. The current was carrying them north, toward the hotel. He looked at his watch and was astonished to see it was 15 minutes past 7. Only 15 minutes had passed since he had last looked at his watch. It seemed like 2 hours. Grant lay back against the rubber gunnels, closed his eyes, and slept. 5th iteration. Flaws in the system will now become severe. Ian Malcolm. Search. Gennaro sat in the jeep and listened to the buzzing of the flies and stared at the distant palm trees wavering in the heat. He was astonished by what looked like a battleground. The grass was trampled flat for 100 yards in every direction. One big palm tree was uprooted from the ground. There were great washes of blood in the grass and on the rocky outcropping to their right. Sitting beside him, Muldoon said, "No doubt about it. Rexy's been among the hadrosaurs." He took another drink of whiskey and capped the bottle. "Damn lot of flies," he said. They waited and watched. Gennaro drummed his fingers on the dashboard. "What are we waiting for?" Muldoon didn't answer immediately. "The Rex is out there somewhere," he said, squinting at the landscape in the morning sun. "And we don't have any weapons worth a damn."
"We're in a jeep."
"Oh, he can outrun the jeep, Mr. Gennaro," Muldoon said, shaking his head. "Once we leave this road and go onto open terrain, the best we can do in a four-wheel drive is 30, 40 miles an hour. He'll run us right down, no problem for him." Muldoon sighed. "I don't see much moving out there now. You ready to live dangerously?" "Sure," Gennaro said. Muldoon started the engine, and at the sudden sound, 2 small ophnelians leapt up from the matted grass directly ahead. Muldoon put the car in gear. He drove in a wide circle around the trampled site and then moved inward, driving in decreasing concentric circles until he finally came to the place in the field where the little ophnelians had been. Then he got out and walked forward in the grass away from the jeep. He stopped as a dense cloud of flies lifted into the air. "What is it?" Gennaro called. "Bring the radio," Muldoon said. Gennaro climbed out of the jeep and hurried forward. Even from a distance, he could smell the sour, sweet odor of early decay. He saw saw a dark shape in the grass, crusted with blood, legs askew. Young hadrosaur, Muldoon said, staring down at the carcass. The whole herd stampeded, and the young one got separated, and the T-Rex brought it down. How do you know? Gennaro said. The flesh was ragged from many bites. You can tell from the excreta, Muldoon said. See those chalky white bits there in the grass? That's hadrospore. Uric acid makes it white. But you look there, he pointed to a large mound rising knee-high in the grass. That's tyrannosaur spore. How do you know the tyrannosaur didn't come later? The bite pattern, Muldoon said. See those little ones there? He pointed along the belly. Those are from the Othies. Those bites haven't bled. They're post-mortem, scavengers. Othies did that. But the hadro was brought down by a bite on the neck. You see the big slash there, above the shoulder blades? That's the T-Rex, no question. Gennaro bent over the carcass, staring at the awkward, trampled limbs with a sense of unreality. Beside him, Muldoon flicked on his radio. Control! Yes, John Arnold said over the radio. We got another hadro dead. Juvenile. Muldoon bent down among the flies and checked the skin on the sole of the right foot. A number was tattooed there. Specimen is number HD-09. The radio crackled. I've got something for you, Arnold said. Oh? What's that? I found Nedry. The jeep burst through the line of palm trees along the east road and came out into a narrower service road leading toward the Jungle River. It was hot in this area of the park, the jungle close and fetid around them.
What?
Muldoon was fiddling with a computer monitor in the jeep, which now showed a map of the resort with overlaid grid lines. They found him up on remote video, he said. Sector 1104 is just ahead. Farther up the road, Gennaro saw a concrete barrier, and the jeep parked alongside it. He must have taken the wrong turn off, Muldoon said, the little bastard. What did he take? Gennaro asked. Wu says 15 embryos. Know what that's worth? Gennaro shook his head. Somewhere between 2 and 10 million, Muldoon said. He shook his head. Big stakes. As they came closer, Gennaro saw the body lying beside the car. The body was indistinct and green. But then green shapes scattered away as the jeep pulled to a stop. Compies, Muldoon said. The compies found him. A dozen procompsognathids, delicate little predators no larger than ducks, stood at the edge of the jungle, chittering excitedly as the men climbed out of the car. Dennis Nedry lay on his back, the chubby, boyish face now red and bloated. Flies buzzed around the gaping mouth and thick tongue. His body was mangled, the intestines torn open, one leg chewed through. Gennaro turned away quickly to look at the little compies which squatted on their hind legs a short distance away and watched the men curiously. The little dinosaurs had 5-fingered hands, he noticed. They wiped their faces and chins, giving them an eerily human quality, which, I'll be damned, Muldoon said. Wasn't the compies. What? Muldoon was shaking his head. See these blotches on his shirt and face? Smell that sweet smell like old dried vomit? Gennaro rolled his eyes. He smelled it. That's Dillo saliva, Muldoon said. Spit from the Dilophosaurs. You see the damage on the corneas, all that redness? In the eyes, it's painful, but not fatal. You've got about 2 hours to wash it out with the antivenin. We keep it all around the park, just in case. Not that it mattered to this bastard. They blinded him, then ripped him down the middle. Not a nice way to go. Maybe there's justice in the world after all. The procompsognathids squeaked and hopped up and down as Muldoon opened the back door and took out gray metal tubing in a stainless steel case. It's all still there, he said. He handed 2 dark cylinders to Gennaro. What are these? Gennaro said. Just what they look like, Muldoon said. Rockets. As Gennaro backed away, he said, Watch it. You don't want to step in something. Gennaro stepped carefully over Nedry's body. Muldoon carried the tubing to the other jeep and placed it in the back. He climbed behind the wheel. Let's go. What about him? Gennaro said, pointing to the body. What about him? Muldoon said. We've got things to do. He put the car in gear. Looking back, Gennaro saw the compies resume their feeding. One jumped up and squatted on Nedry's open mouth as it nibbled the flesh of his nose. The jungle river became narrower. The banks closed in on both sides until the trees and foliage overhanging the banks met high above to block out the sun. Tim heard the cry of birds and saw small chirping dinosaurs leaping among the branches. But mostly it was silent, the air hot and still beneath the canopy of trees. Grant looked at his watch. It was 8 o'clock. They drifted along peacefully among dappled patches of light. If anything, they seemed to be moving faster than before. Awake now, Grant lay on his back and stared up at the branches overhead. In the bow, he saw Lex reaching up. "Hey, what are you doing?" he said.
You think we can eat these berries?
She pointed to the trees. Some of the overhanging branches were close enough to touch. Tim saw clusters of bright red berries on the branches. "No," Grant said.
Why, those little dinosaurs are eating them.
He pointed to small dinosaurs scampering in the branches. "No, Lex." She sighed, dissatisfied with his authority. "I wish Daddy was here," she said. "Daddy always knows what to do." "What are you talking about?" Tim said. "He never knows what to do." "Yes, he does." She sighed. Lex stared at the trees as they slid past, their big roots twisting toward the water's edge. "Just because you're not his favorite." Tim turned away, said nothing.
But don't worry, Daddy likes you too, even if you're into computers and not sports.
"Dad's a real sports nut," Tim explained to Grant. Grant nodded. Up in the branches, small, pale yellow dinosaurs, barely 2 feet tall, hopped from tree to tree. They had beaky heads like parrots. "You know what they call those?" Tim said. "Microceratops."
Big deal,
Lex said. "I thought you might be interested."
Only very young boys, she said, are interested in dinosaurs. Says who? Daddy.
Tim started to yell, but Grant raised his hand. "Kids," he said, "shut up."
Why? Lex said. I can do what I want if I...
Then she fell silent, because she heard it too. It was a blood-curdling shriek from somewhere downriver. "Well, where the hell is the damned Rex?" Muldoon said, talking into the radio. "Because we don't see him here." They were back at the sauropod compound, looking out at the trampled grass where the hadrosaurs had stampeded. The tyrannosaur was nowhere to be found. "Checking now," Arnold said, and clicked off. Muldoon turned to Gennaro. "Checking now," he repeated sarcastically. "Why the hell didn't he check before? Why didn't he keep track of it?" "I don't know," Gennaro said. "He's not showing up," Arnold said a moment later. "What do you mean he's not showing up? He's not on the monitors. Motion sensors aren't finding him." "Hell," Muldoon said. "So much for the motion sensors. You see Grant and the kids? Motion sensors aren't finding them either." "Well, what are we supposed to do now?" Muldoon said. "Wait," Arnold said.
Look! Look!
Directly ahead, the big dome of the aviary rose above them. Grant had seen it only from a distance. Now he realized it was enormous, 1/4 of a mile in diameter or more. The pattern of geodesic struts shone dully through the light mist, and his first thought was that the glass must weigh a ton. Then as they came closer, he saw there wasn't any glass, just struts. A thin mesh hung inside the elements.
It isn't finished,
Lex said. "I think it's meant to be open like that," Grant said.
Then all the birds can fly out.
"Not if they're big birds," Grant said. The river carried them beneath the edge of the dome. They stared upward. Now they were inside the dome, still drifting down the river. But within minutes, the dome was so high above them that it was hardly visible in the mist. Grant said, "I seem to remember there's a second lodge here." Moments later, he saw the roof of the building over the tops of the trees to the north. "You want to stop?" Tim said. "Maybe there's a phone, or motion sensors." Grant steered toward the shore. "We need to try to contact the control room. It's getting late." They clambered out, slipping on the muddy bank, and Grant hauled the raft out of the water. Then he tied the rope to a tree, and they set off through a dense forest of palm trees. Aviary.
Part of the farm.
"I just don't understand," John Arnold said, speaking into the phone. "I don't see the Rex, and I don't see Grant and the kids anywhere either." He sat in front of the consoles and gulped another cup of coffee. All around him, the control room was strewn with paper plates and half-eaten sandwiches. Arnold was exhausted. It was 8 a.m. on Saturday. In the 14 hours since Nedry destroyed the computer that ran Jurassic Park, Arnold had patiently pulled systems back online, one after another. All the park systems are back and functioning correctly. The phones are working. I've called for a doctor for you. On the other end of the line, Malcolm coughed. Arnold was talking to him in his room at the lodge. But you're having trouble with the motion sensors? Well, I'm not finding what I'm looking for. Like the Rex? He's not reading at all now. He started north about 20 minutes ago, following along the edge of the lagoon, and then I lost him. I don't know why, unless he's gone to sleep again. And you can't find Grant and the kids? No. I think it's quite simple, Malcolm said. The motion sensors cover an inadequate area. Inadequate? Arnold bristled. They cover 92% of the land area, I remember, Malcolm said. But if you put the remaining areas up on the board, I think you'll find that the 8% is topologically unified, meaning that those areas are contiguous. In essence, an animal can move freely anywhere in the park and escape detection by following a maintenance road or the jungle river or the beaches or whatever. Even if that were so, Arnold said, the animals are too stupid to know that. It's not clear how stupid the animals are, Malcolm said. You think that's what Grant and the kids are doing? Arnold said. Definitely not, Malcolm said, coughing again. Grant's no fool. He clearly wants to be detected by you. He and the kids are probably waving at every motion sensor in sight. But maybe they have other problems we don't know about. Or maybe they're on the river. I can't imagine they'd be on the river. The banks are very narrow. It's impossible to walk along there. Would the river bring them all the way back here? Yes, but it's not the safest way to go, because it passes through the aviary. Why wasn't the aviary on the tour? Malcolm said. We've had problems setting it up. Originally, the park was intended to have a treetop lodge built high above the ground where visitors could observe the pterodactyls at flight level. We've got 4 dactyls in the aviary now. Actually, they're pterodactyls, which are big fish-eating dactyls. What about them? Well, while we finished the lodge, we put the dactyls in the aviary to acclimate them. But that was a big mistake. It turns out our fish hunters are territorial. Territorial? Fiercely territorial, Arnold said. They fight among themselves for territory, and they'll attack any other animal that comes into the area they've marked out. Attack? It's impressive, Arnold said. The dactyls glide to the top of the aviary, fold up their wings, and dive. A 30-pound animal will strike a man on the ground like a ton of bricks. They were knocking the workmen unconscious, cutting them up pretty badly. That doesn't injure the dactyls? Not so far. So if those kids are in the aviary, they're not, Arnold said. At least I hope they're not.
Guys.
Is that the lodge? Lex said. What a dump.
Beneath the aviary dome, Teratop's lodge was built high above the ground on big wooden pylons in the middle of a stand of fir trees. But the building was unfinished and unpainted. The windows were boarded up. The trees and the lodge were splattered with broad white streaks. I guess they didn't finish it for some reason, Grant said, hiding his disappointment. He glanced at his watch. Come on, let's go back to the boat. The sun came out as they walked along, making the morning more cheerful. Grant looked at the latticework shadows on the ground from the dome above. He noticed that the ground and the foliage were spattered with broad streaks of the same white chalky substance that had been on the building. And there was a distinctive sour odor in the morning air.
Stinks here, Lex said. What's all that white stuff?
Looks like reptile droppings, probably from the birds.
How come they didn't finish the lodge?
I don't know. They entered a clearing of low grass dotted with wildflowers. They heard a long, low whistle, then an answering whistle from across the forest.
What's that?
I don't know. Then Grant saw the dark shadow of a cloud on the grassy field ahead. The shadow was moving fast. In moments it had swept over them. He looked up and saw an enormous dark shape gliding above them, blotting out the sun.
Yow!
Lex said.
Is it a pterodactyl?
Yes, Tim said. Grant didn't answer. He was entranced by the sight of the huge flying creature. In the sky above, the pterodactyl gave a low whistle and wheeled gracefully, turning back toward them.
How come they're not on the tour?
Tim said. Grant was wondering the same thing. The flying dinosaurs were so beautiful, so graceful as they moved through the air. As Grant watched, he saw a second pterodactyl appear in the sky, and a third, and a fourth.
Maybe because they didn't finish the lodge,
Lex said. Grant was thinking these weren't ordinary pterodactyls. They were too large. They must be pterodactyls, big flying reptiles from the early Cretaceous. When they were high, these looked like small airplanes. When they came lower, he could see the animals had 15-foot wingspans, furry bodies, and heads like crocodiles. They ate fish, he remembered, in South America and Mexico. Lex shaded her eyes and looked up at the sky.
Can they hurt us?
I don't think so. They eat fish. One of the dactyls spiraled down, a flashing dark shadow that whooshed past them with a rush of warm air and a lingering sour odor.
Wow,
Lex said. They're really big. And then she said,
are you sure they can't hurt us?
pretty sure. A second dactyl swooped down, moving faster than the first. It came from behind, streaked over their heads. Grant had a glimpse of its toothy beak and furry body. It looked like a huge bat, he thought. But Grant was impressed with the frail appearance of the animals. Their huge wingspans, the delicate pink membranes stretched across them, so thin they were translucent, everything reinforced the delicacy of the dactyl.
Ow!
Lex shouted, grabbing her hair.
He bit me!
He what? Grant said.
He bit me! He bit me!
When she took her hand away, he saw blood on her fingers. Up in the sky, two more dactyls folded their wings, collapsing into small, dark shapes that plummeted toward the ground. They made a kind of scream as they hurtled downward. Come on, Grant said, grabbing their hands. They ran across the meadow, hearing the approaching scream, and he flung himself on the ground at the last moment, pulling the kids down with him, as the two dactyls whistled and squeaked past them, flapping their wings. Grant felt claws tear the shirt along his back. Then he was up, pulling Lex back onto her feet, and running with Tim a few feet forward, while overhead two more birds wheeled and dove toward them, screaming. At the last moment, he pushed the kids to the ground, and the big shadows flapped past.
Ugh!
Lex said, disgusted. He saw that she was streaked with white droppings from the birds. Grant scrambled to his feet. Come on! He was about to run when Lex shrieked in terror. He turned back and saw that one of the dactyls had grabbed her by the shoulders with its hind claws. The animal's huge, leathery wings, translucent in the sunlight, flapped broadly on both sides of her. The dactyl was trying to take off, but Lex was too heavy, and while it struggled, it repeatedly jabbed at her head with its long, pointed jaw. Lex was screaming, waving her arms wildly. Grant did the only thing he could think to do. He ran forward and jumped up, throwing himself against the body of the dactyl. He knocked it onto its back on the ground and fell on top of the furry body. The animal screamed and snapped. Grant ducked his head away from the jaws and pushed back as the giant wings beat around his body. It was like being in a tent in a windstorm. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear. There was nothing but the flapping and shrieking and the leathery membranes. The clawed legs scratched frantically at his chest. Lex was screaming. Grant pushed away from the dactyl, and it squeaked and gibbered as it flapped its wings and struggled to turn over to right itself. Finally, it pulled in its wings like a bat and rolled over, lifted itself up on its little wing claws, and began to walk that way. He paused, astonished. It could walk on its wings. Lederer's speculation was right. But then the other dactyls were diving down at them, and Grant was dizzy, off balance, and in horror he saw Lex run away, her arms over her head, Tim shouting at the top of his lungs. The first of them swooped down, and she threw something, and suddenly the dactyl whistled and climbed. The other dactyls immediately climbed and chased the first into the sky. The fourth dactyl flapped awkwardly into the air to join the others. Grant looked upward, squinting to see what had happened. The three dactyls chased the first, screaming angrily. They were alone in the field. What happened? Grant said.
They got my glove, Lex said. My Daryl Strawberry special.
They started walking again. Tim put his arm around her shoulders.
Are you all right? Of course, stupid, she said, shaking him off.
She looked upward.
I hope they choke and die, she said.
Yeah, Tim said. Me too. Up ahead, they saw the boat on the shore. Grant looked at his watch. It was 8:30. He now had 2.5 hours to get back. Lex cheered as they drifted beyond the silver aviary dome. Then the banks of the river closed in on both sides, the trees meeting overhead. The current flowed very fast. Lex reached up to touch the branches as they went past. Grant sat back in the raft and listened to the gurgle of the water through the warm river. Moving fast now, the branches overhead slipping by more rapidly. It was pleasant. It gave a little breeze in the hot confines of the overhanging branches. Grant couldn't guess how far they'd come, but it must be several miles at least from the shore where they went. Perhaps 4 or 5 miles, maybe even more. That meant they might be only an hour's walk from the town once they left. But after the aviary,
I wonder how Ralph is, I said. He's probably dead.
I'm sure he's fine.
I wonder if he'd let me ride him.
She sighed.
That would be fun, to ride Ralph.
Tim said to Grant,
Remember back in the Stegosaurus the first night? How come you asked him about frog DNA?
because of the breeding, Grant said. They can't explain why the dinosaurs are breeding since they irradiate.
Right.
Well, irradiation is notoriously unreliable. Probably doesn't work. I think that'll eventually stop. But there is still the problem of the dinosaurs being female. How can they breed on their own? Well, across the animal kingdom, sexual reproduction exists in extraordinary variety.
Tim's very interested in sex,
Lex said. They both ignored her. For example, Grant said, many animals have sexual reproduction without ever having what we would call sex. The male releases the spermatozoa, which contains the sperm, and the female picks it up at a later time. This kind of exchange does not require quite as much physical differentiation as male and female usually think exists. Male and female are more alike in some animals than they are in human beings. It's not.
What about the frog?
Grant heard something shriek to the trees above. Lightning started scattered, arms shaking the branches. The big head of the Tyrannosaur lunged through the foliage to the left, the jaws snapping at the raft. Lex howled in terror, and Grant paddled away toward the opposite bank, but the river here was only 10 feet wide. The Tyrannosaur was caught in the heavy growth. It butted and twisted its head and roared. Then it pulled its head back. Through the trees that lined the riverbank, they saw the huge dark form of the Tyrannosaur moving north, looking for a gap in the trees that lined the bank. The Microceratopsians had all gone to the opposite bank, where they shrieked and scampered and jumped up and down. In the raft, Grant, Tim, and Lex stared helplessly as the Tyrannosaur tried to break through again. But the trees were too dense along the banks of the river. The Tyrannosaur again moved downstream ahead of the boat and tried again, shaking the branches furiously. But again it failed. Then it moved off, heading farther downstream.
I hate him,
Lex said. Grant sat back in the boat, badly shaken. If the Tyrannosaur had broken through, there was nothing he could have done to save them. The river was so narrow that it was hardly wider than the raft. It was like being in a tunnel. The rubber gunnels often scraped on the mud as the boat was pulled along by the swift current. He glanced at his watch. Almost 9. The raft continued downstream.
Hey,
Lex said.
listen.
He heard snarling, interspersed by a repeated hooting cry. The cries were coming from beyond a curve farther downriver. He listened and heard the hooting again.
What is it?
Lex said. I don't know, Grant said, but there's more than one of them. He paddled the boat to the opposite bank, grabbed a branch to stop the raft. The snarling was repeated, then more hooting.
It sounds like a bunch of owls, Tim said.
Malcolm groaned. Isn't it time for more morphine yet?
Not yet,
Ellie said. Malcolm sighed. How much water have we got here?
I don't know. There's plenty of running water from the tap.
No, I mean, how much stored? Any? Ellie shrugged.
None.
Go into the rooms on this floor, Malcolm said, and fill the bathtubs with water. Ellie frowned. Also, Malcolm said, have we got any walkie-talkies?
Flashlights, matches, sterno stoves, things like that? I'll look around. You planning for an earthquake?
Something like that, Malcolm said. Malcolm effect implies catastrophic changes.
But Arnold says all the systems are working perfectly.
That's when it happens, Malcolm said. Ellie said,
You don't think much of Arnold, do you?
He's all right. He's an engineer. Wu's the same. They're both technicians. They don't have intelligence. They have what I call thin intelligence. They see the immediate situation. They think narrowly, and they call it being focused. They don't see the surround. They don't see the consequences. That's how you get an island like this, from thin, intelligent thinking. Because you cannot make an animal and not expect it to act alive, to be unpredictable, to escape. But they don't see that.
Don't you think it's just human nature? Ellie said.
God, no, Malcolm said. That's like saying scrambled eggs and bacon for breakfast is human nature. It's nothing of the sort. It's uniquely Western training. And much of the rest of the world is nauseated by the thought of it. He winced in pain. Oh, the morphine's making me philosophical.
You want some water?
No. I'll tell you the problem with engineers and scientists. Scientists have an elaborate line of bullshit about how they are seeking to know the truth about nature, which is true, but that's not what drives them. Nobody is driven by abstractions like seeking truth. Scientists are actually preoccupied with accomplishment, so they are focused on whether they can do something. They never stop to ask if they should do something. They conveniently define such considerations as pointless. If they don't do it, someone else will. Discovery, they believe, is inevitable, so they just try to do it first. That's the game in science. Even pure scientific discovery is an aggressive, penetrative act. It takes big equipment, and it literally changes the world afterward. Particle accelerators scar the land and leave radioactive byproducts. Astronauts leave trash on the moon. There's always some proof that scientists were there, making their discoveries. Discovery is always a rape of the natural world, always. The scientists want it that way. They have to stick their instruments in, they have to leave their mark. They can't just watch. They can't just appreciate. They can't just fit into the natural order. They have to make something unnatural happen. That is the scientist's job. And now we have whole societies that try to be scientific. He sighed and sank back. Ellie said, Don't you think you're overstating? What does one of your excavations look like a year later? Pretty bad, she admitted. You don't replant? You don't restore the land after you dig?
No.
Why not? She shrugged.
There's no money, I guess.
There's only enough money to dig, but not to repair.
Well, we're just working in the Badlands.
Just the Badlands, Malcolm said, shaking his head. Just trash, just byproducts, just side effects. I'm trying to tell you that scientists want it this way. They want byproducts and trash and scars and side effects. It's a way of reassuring themselves. It's built into the fabric of science, and it's increasingly a disaster.
Then what's the answer?
Get rid of the thin-intelligent ones. Take them out of power.
But then we'd lose all the advances.
What advances? Malcolm said irritably. The number of hours women devote to housework has not changed since 1930, despite all the advances. All the vacuum cleaners, washer dryers, trash compactors, garbage disposals, wash and wear fabrics. Why does it still take as long to clean the house as it did in 1930? Ellie said nothing. Because there haven't been any advances, Malcolm said. Not really. 30,000 years ago, when men were doing cave paintings at Lascaux, they worked 20 hours a week to provide themselves with food and shelter and clothing. The rest of the time they could play, or sleep, or do whatever they wanted. And they lived in a natural world with clean air, clean water, beautiful trees and sunsets. Think about it, 20 hours a week, 30,000 years ago. Ellie said, "You want to turn back the clock?" "No," Malcolm said. "I want people to wake up. We've had 400 years of modern science, and we ought to know by now what it's good for and what it's not good for. It's time for a change." "Before we destroy the planet," she said. He sighed and closed his eyes. "Oh dear," he said. "That's the last thing I would worry about." In the dark tunnel of the jungle river, Grant went hand over hand, holding branches, moving the raft cautiously forward. He still heard the sounds, and finally he saw the dinosaurs. "Aren't those the ones that are poisoned?" "Yes," Grant said. "Dilophosaurus." Standing on the riverbank were two Dilophosaurs. The 10-foot-tall bodies were spotted yellow and black. Underneath, the bellies were bright green, like lizards. Twin red curving crests ran along the top of the head from the eyes to the nose, making a V shape above the head. The bird-like quality was reinforced by the way they moved, bending to drink from the river, then rising to snarl and hoot. Lex whispered, "Should we get out and walk?" Grant shook his head no. The Dilophosaurs were smaller than the Tyrannosaur, small enough to slip through the dense foliage at the banks of the river. They seemed quick as they snarled and hooted at each other. "But we can't get past them in the boat," Lex said. "They're poisoned." "We have to," Grant said, "somehow." The Dilophosaurs continued to drink and hoot. They seemed to be interacting with each other in a strangely ritualistic, repetitive way. The animal on the left would bend to drink, opening its mouth to bear long rows of sharp teeth, and then it would hoot. The animal on the right would hoot in reply and bend to drink in a mirror image of the first animal's movements. Then the sequence would be repeated exactly the same way. Grant noticed that the animal on the right was smaller, with smaller spots on its back, and its crest was a duller red. "I'll be damned," he said. "It's a mating ritual." "Can we get past them?" Tim asked. "Not the way they are now. They're right by the edge of the water." Grant knew animals often performed such mating rituals for hours at a time. They went without food. They paid attention to nothing else. He glanced at his watch. 9:20. "What do we do?" Tim said. Grant sighed. "I have no idea." He sat down in the raft, and then the Dilophosaurs began to honk and roar repeatedly in agitation. He looked up. The animals were both facing away from the river. "What is it?" Lex said. Grant smiled. "I think we're finally getting some help." He pushed off from the bank. "I want you two kids to lie flat on the rubber. We'll go past as fast as we can, but just remember, whatever happens, don't say anything. And don't move, okay?" The raft began to drift downstream toward the hooting Dilophosaurs. It gained speed. Lex lay at Grant's feet, staring at him with frightened eyes. They were coming closer to the Dilophosaurs, which were still turned away from the river. But he pulled out his air pistol, checked the chamber. The raft continued on, and they smelled a peculiar odor, sweet and nauseating at the same time. It smelled like dried vomit. The hooting of the Dilophosaurs was louder. The raft came around a final bend, and Grant caught his breath. The Dilophosaurs were just a few feet away, honking at the trees beyond the river. As Grant had suspected, they were honking at the Tyrannosaur. The Tyrannosaur was trying to break through the foliage, and the Dillos hooted and stomped their feet in the mud. The raft drifted past them. The smell was nauseating. The Tyrannosaur roared, probably because it saw the raft. But in another moment, a thump. The raft stopped moving. They were aground against the riverbank, just a few feet downstream from the Dilophosaurs. Lex whispered, "Oh, great." There was a long, slow scraping sound of the raft against the mud. Then the raft was moving again. They were going down the river. The Tyrannosaur roared a final time and moved off. One Dilophosaur looked surprised, then hooted. The other Dilophosaur hooted in reply. The raft floated downriver. Tyrannosaur. The Jeep bounced along in the glaring sun. Muldoon was driving, with Gennaro at his side. They were in an open field moving away from the dense line of foliage and palm trees that marked the course of the river 100 yards to the east. They came to a rise, and Muldoon stopped the car. "Christ, it's hot," he said, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. He drank from the bottle of whiskey between his knees, then offered it to Gennaro. Gennaro shook his head. He stared at the landscape shimmering in the morning heat. Then he looked down at the onboard computer and video monitor mounted in the dashboard. The monitor showed views of the park from remote cameras. Still no sign of Grant and the children, or of the Tyrannosaur. The radio crackled. "Muldoon?" Muldoon picked up the handset. "Yeah. You got your onboards? I found the Rex. He's in grid 442, going to 443. "Just a minute," Muldoon said, adjusting the monitor. "Yeah, I got him now. Following the river." The animal was slinking along the foliage that lined the banks of the river going north. "Take it easy with him, just immobilize him." "Don't worry," Muldoon said, squinting in the sun. "I won't hurt him." "Remember," Arnold said, "the Tyrannosaur's our main tourist attraction." Muldoon turned off his radio with a crackle of static. "You're still talking about tourists." Muldoon started the engine. "Let's go see Rexy and give him a dose." The Jeep jolted. "You're looking forward to this," Gennaro said. "I've wanted to put a needle in this big bastard for a while," Muldoon said. "And there he is." They came to a wrenching stop. Through the windshield, Gennaro saw the Tyrannosaur directly ahead of them, moving among the palm trees along the river. Muldoon drained the whiskey bottle and threw it in the back seat. He reached back for his tubing. Gennaro looked at the video monitor which showed their Jeep and the Tyrannosaur. There must be a closed-circuit camera in the trees somewhere behind. "You want to help?" Muldoon said. "You can break out those canisters by your feet." Gennaro bent over and opened a stainless steel Halliburton case. It was padded inside with foam. 4 cylinders, each the size of a quart milk bottle, were nestled in the foam. They were all labeled Moro 709. He took one out. "You snap off the tip and screw on a needle," Muldoon explained. Gennaro found a plastic package of large needles, each the diameter of his fingertip. He screwed one onto the canister. The opposite end of the canister had a circular lead weight. "That's the plunger. Compresses on impact." Muldoon sat forward with the air rifle across his knees. It was made of heavy gray tubular metal and looked at Gennaro like a bazooka or a rocket launcher. "What's Moro 709? "Standard animal trank," Muldoon said. "Zoos around the world use it. We'll try 1,000 cc's to start." Muldoon cracked open the chamber, which was large enough to insert his fist. He slipped the canister into the chamber and closed it. "That should do it," Muldoon said. "Standard elephant gets about 200 cc's, but they're only 2 or 3 tons each. Tyrannosaurus Rex is 8 tons, and a lot meaner. That matters to the dose." "Why?" "Animal dose is partly body weight and partly temperament. You shoot the same dose of 709 into an elephant, a hippo, and a rhino, you'd immobilize the elephant so it just stands there like a statue. You'll slow down the hippo so it gets kind of sleepy, but it keeps moving. And the rhino will just get fighting mad. But on the other hand, you chase a rhino for more than 5 minutes in a car and he'll drop dead from adrenaline shock. Strange combination of tough and delicate." Muldoon drove slowly toward the river, moving closer to the Tyrannosaur. "But those are all mammals. We know a lot about handling mammals because zoos are built around the big mammalian attractions. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants. We know a lot less about reptiles. And nobody knows anything about dinosaurs. The dinosaurs are new animals." "You consider them reptiles?" Gennaro said. "No," Muldoon said, shifting gears. "Dinosaurs don't fit existing categories." He swerved to avoid a rock. "Actually, what we find is that dinosaurs were as variable as mammals are today. Some dinos are tame and cute, and some are mean and nasty. Some of them see well, and some of them don't. Some of them are stupid, and some of them are very, very intelligent." "Like the raptors?" Gennaro said. Muldoon nodded. "Raptors are smart. Very smart. Believe me, all the problems we have so far," he said, "are nothing compared with what we'd have if the raptors ever got out of their holding pen.
Foreshadowing.
I think this is as close as we can get to our Rexy." Up ahead, the Tyrannosaur was poking its head through the branches, peering toward the river, trying to get through.
I'd really like to see
Then the animal moved a few yards downstream to try again. "Wonder what he sees in there," Gennaro said. "Hard to know," Muldoon said. "Maybe he's trying to get to the Microceratopsians that scramble around in the branches. They'll run him a merry chase." Muldoon stopped the Jeep about 50 yards away from the Tyrannosaur and turned the vehicle around. He left the motor running. "Get behind the wheel," Muldoon said, "and put your seatbelt on." He took another canister and hooked it onto his shirt. Then he got out. Gennaro slid behind the wheel. "You done this very often before?" Muldoon belched. "Never. I'll try to get him just behind the auditory meatus. We'll see how it goes from there." He walked 10 yards behind the Jeep and crouched down in the grass on one knee. He steadied the big gun against his shoulder and flipped up the thick telescopic sight. Muldoon aimed at the Tyrannosaur, which still ignored them. There was a burst of pale gas, and Gennaro saw a white streak shoot forward in the air toward the Tyrannosaur, but nothing seemed to happen. Then the Tyrannosaur turned slowly, curiously, to peer at them. It moved its head from side to side, as if looking at them with alternate eyes. Muldoon had taken down the launcher and was loading the second canister. "You hit him?" Gennaro said. Muldoon shook his head. "Missed. Damn laser sights. See if there's a battery in the case." "A what?" Gennaro said. "A battery," Muldoon said. "It's about as big as your finger, gray markings." Gennaro bent over to look in the steel case. He felt the vibration of the Jeep, heard the motor ticking over. He didn't see a battery. The Tyrannosaur roared. To Gennaro, it was a terrifying sound, rumbling from the great chest cavity of the animal, bellowing out over the landscape. He sat up sharply and reached for the steering wheel, put his hand on the gear shift. On the radio, he heard a voice say, "Muldoon, this is Arnold. Get out of there. Over." "I know what I'm doing," Muldoon said. The Tyrannosaur charged.
Copycats.
Muldoon stood his ground. Despite the creature racing toward him, he slowly and methodically raised his launcher, aimed, and fired. Once again, Gennaro saw the puff of smoke and the white streak of the canister going toward the animal. Nothing happened. The Tyrannosaur continued to charge. Now Muldoon was on his feet and running, shouting, "Go! Go!" Gennaro put the Jeep in gear, and Muldoon threw himself onto the side door as the Jeep lurched forward. The Tyrannosaur was closing rapidly, and Muldoon swung the door open and climbed inside. "Go! Damn it, go!" Gennaro floored it. The Jeep bounced precariously, the front end nosing so high they saw only sky through the windshield, then slamming down again toward the ground and racing forward again. Gennaro headed for a stand of trees to the left, until in the rearview mirror he saw the Tyrannosaur give a final roar and turn away. Gennaro slowed the car. "Jesus!" Muldoon was shaking his head. "I could have sworn I hit him the second time." "I'd say you missed," Gennaro said. "Needle must have broken off before the plunger injected." "Admit it, you missed." "Yeah," Muldoon said. He sighed. "I missed. Battery was dead in the damn laser sight. My fault. I should have checked it after it was out all last night. Let's go back and get more canisters." The Jeep headed north toward the hotel. Muldoon picked up the radio. "Control?" "Yes? We're heading back to base." The river was now very narrow and flowing swiftly. The raft was going faster all the time. It was starting to feel like an amusement park ride. "Whee!" Lex yelled, holding onto the gunnel. "Faster! Faster!" Grant squinted, looking forward. The river was still narrow and dark, but farther ahead he could see the trees ended, and there was bright sunlight beyond, and a distant roaring sound. The river seemed to end abruptly in a peculiar flat line. The raft was going still faster, rushing forward. Grant grabbed for his paddles. "What is it?" "It's a waterfall," Grant said. The raft swept out of the overhanging darkness into brilliant morning sunlight and raced forward on the swift current toward the lip of the waterfall. The roar was loud in their ears.
What's
Grant paddled as strongly as he could,
Yep.
but he only succeeded in spinning the boat in circles. It continued inexorably toward the lip. Lex leaned toward him.
I can't swim.
Grant saw that she did not have her life vest clasped, but there was nothing he could do about it. With frightening speed, they came to the edge, and the roar of the waterfall seemed to fill the world. Grant jammed his oar deep into the water, felt it catch and hold right at the lip. The rubber raft shuddered in the current, but they did not go over. Grant strained against the oar, and looking over the edge, saw the sheer drop of 50 feet down to the surging pool below. And standing in the surging pool, waiting for them, was the Tyrannosaur. Lex was screaming in panic, and then the boat spun, and the rear end dropped away, spilling them out into air and roaring water, and they fell sickeningly. Grant flailed his arms in the air, and the world went suddenly silent and slow. It seemed to him he fell for long minutes. He had time to observe Lex, clutching her orange jacket, falling alongside him. He had time to observe Tim, looking down at the bottom. He had time to observe the frozen white sheet of the waterfall. He had time to observe the bubbling pool beneath him as he fell slowly, silently toward it. Then, with a stinging slap, Grant plunged into cold water, surrounded by white boiling bubbles. He tumbled and spun and glimpsed the leg of the Tyrannosaur as he swirled past it, swept down through the pool and out into the stream beyond. Grant swam for the shore, clutched warm rock, slipped off, caught a branch, and finally pulled himself out of the main current. Gasping, he dragged himself on his belly onto the rocks and looked at the river just in time to see the brown rubber raft tumble past him. Then he saw Tim battling the current, and he reached out and pulled him, coughing and shivering, onto the shore beside him. Grant turned back to the waterfall and saw the Tyrannosaur plunge its head straight down into the water of the pool at its feet. The great head shook, splashing water to either side. It had something between its teeth. And then the Tyrannosaur lifted its head back up. Dangling from the jaws was Lex's orange life vest. A moment later, Lex bobbed to the surface beside the dinosaur's long tail. She lay face down in the water. Her little body swept downstream. Grant plunged into the water after her, was again immersed in the churning torrent. A moment later, he pulled her up onto the rocks, a heavy, lifeless weight. Her face was gray. Water poured from her mouth. Grant bent over her to give her mouth to mouth, but she coughed. Then she vomited yellow-green liquid and coughed again. Her eyelids fluttered.
Hi.
She said. She smiled weakly.
We did it.
Tim started to cry. She coughed again.
Will you stop it? What are you crying for?
Because we were worried about you, Grant said. Small flecks of white were drifting down the river. The Tyrannosaur was tearing up the life vest. Still turned away from them, facing the waterfall. But at any moment, the animal might turn and see them. Come on, kids, he said.
Where are we going?
Lex said, coughing. Come on. He was looking for a hiding place. Downstream, he saw only an open, grassy plain affording no protection. Upstream was a dinosaur. Then Grant saw a dirt path by the river. It seemed to lead up toward the waterfall. And in the dirt, he saw the clear imprint of a man's shoe leading up the path. The Tyrannosaur finally turned around, growling and looking out toward the grassy plain. It seemed to have figured out that they had gotten away. It was looking for them downstream. Grant and the kids ducked among the big ferns that lined the riverbanks. Cautiously, he led them upstream.
Where are we going?
Lex said.
We're going back.
I know. They were closer to the waterfall now, the roar much louder. The rocks became slippery, the path muddy. There was a constant hanging mist. It was like moving through a cloud. The path seemed to lead right into the rushing water, but as they came closer, they saw that it actually went behind the waterfall. The Tyrannosaur was still looking downstream, its back turned to them. They hurried along the path to the waterfall, and it almost moved behind the sheet of falling water when Grant saw the Tyrannosaur turn. Then they were completely behind the waterfall, and Grant was unable to see out through the silver sheet. Grant looked around in surprise. There was a little recess here, hardly larger than a closet, and filled with machinery, humming pumps and big filters and pipes. Everything was wet and cold. "Did he see us?" Lex said. She had to shout over the noise of the falling water. "Where are we? What is this place? Did he see us?" "Just a minute," Grant said. He was looking at the equipment. This was clearly parked machinery, and there must be electricity to run it. So perhaps there was also a telephone for communication. He poked among the filters and pipes. "What are you doing?" Lex shouted. "Looking for a telephone." It was now nearly 10 a.m. They had just a little more than an hour to contact the ship before it reached the mainland. In the back of the recess, he found a metal door marked Maint 04, but it was firmly locked. Next to it was a slot for a security card. Alongside the door, he saw a row of metal boxes. He opened the boxes one after another, but they contained only switches and timers, no telephone, and nothing to open the door. He almost missed the box to the left of the door. On opening it, he found a 9-button keypad covered with spots of green mold, but it looked as if it was a way to open the door, and he had the feeling that on the other side of that door was a phone. Scratched in the metal of the box was the number 1023. He punched it in. With a hiss, the door came open. Gaping darkness beyond, concrete steps leading downward. On the back wall, he saw stenciled Maint Vehicle 04-22 Charger and an arrow pointing down the stairs. Could it really mean there was a car? "Come on, kids!" "Forget it," Lex said. "I'm not going in there." "Come on, Lex," Tim said. "Forget it," Lex said. "There's no lights or anything. I'm not going." "Never mind," Grant said. There wasn't time to argue. "Stay here and I'll be right back." End of side 9.
All right. 3:25. We've got. Oh yeah, we're about halfway through. A little, little over halfway to go. Another half to go on this last video. I don't know how many more sides, sides, I guess, of the DVD set this would be, but we are probably going to call it for now. So, on day 365, wait, correction, can't read. 965. So we've just got 35 days left. I think I'm gonna go ahead and end stream because I'm kind of tired. Even though it's 4 p.m., I think I'm gonna take a nap and then I'm gonna either, we'll see, maybe I'll feel like streaming later tonight. Probably not. And then we shall see. Yeah, at the very least, I plan on streaming again tomorrow, and I have a different. I'd like to finish this book, and in addition to that, I'd like to finish my, not finish, but I'd like to hit day 1,000. Thank you, Jocelyn. I can see you've been hanging out in the chat this whole time. Very nice of you. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Oh well. I'm not gonna change that. It's also a little too late. I am sorry if I'm getting that wrong. Just throwing that out there. But yeah, I think it is time to go ahead and end the stream. So, see you guys another day.